Friedrich Nietzsche sits at his father's grave in Rücken, Prussia, on a grey afternoon in 1849. The 5-year-old boy, son of Lutheran pastor Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, clutches his mother's hand whilst the village pastor intones familiar prayers over the fresh earth. This child, raised on biblical verses and hymns, surrounded by the certainties of Christian faith, will grow up to write one of the most revolutionary statements in modern philosophy: God is dead and we have killed him. The biographical irony cuts deeper than mere personal transformation. In Nietzsche's life, we witness the embodiment of European civilization's spiritual crisis, the faithful child becoming Christianity's most penetrating critic, the pastor's son diagnosing the collapse of the very foundations his father served. Young Friedrich's immersion in religious ritual and biblical study wasn't merely childhood experience, but the foundation for his later genealogical method. He learned to read the Bible as literature, to understand the historical development of religious ideas, to see how spiritual truths emerge from human needs and cultural contexts. When his father died so early, leaving the boy to mature amongst women in a household heavy with Lutheran piety, Nietzsche absorbed both the emotional power of religious faith and its human, all too human origins. This tension would define his entire philosophical project. How do you live when the foundations of meaning collapse beneath your feet? The question escalates beyond personal crisis to civilizational diagnosis. How do you create values when all inherited values prove hollow shells? How do you affirm life when existence seems meaningless and suffering appears without purpose? For Nietzsche, these weren't abstract philosophical puzzles, but the lived crisis of a brilliant mind watching European civilization lose its spiritual center. His famous declaration from the Gay Science captures the existential urgency. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. This wasn't celebration, but diagnosis of the most profound cultural crisis in Western history, the death of God as the collapse of metaphysical foundations that had sustained meaning for over a millennium. Nietzsche emerges as philosophy's great iconoclast through a dramatic intellectual transformation that mirrors Europe's spiritual upheaval. The classical scholar becomes a cultural physician. The professor abandons academic respectability. The lonely prophet points toward human self-creation beyond traditional morality. At 24, he becomes the youngest professor of classical philology at Basel University, a prodigy destined for scholarly distinction. Yet within a decade, he abandons his professorship to wander through European cities, Turin, Nice, Sils Maria, battling illness and isolation whilst developing his revolutionary philosophy. His friendship and bitter break with Richard Wagner embodies the broader cultural tensions he diagnosed. The artist who initially seemed to represent German cultural renewal ultimately revealed the decadent romanticism Nietzsche saw poisoning modern life. I am not a man, I am dynamite, he declares in Ecce Homo, capturing his sense of philosophical mission. His personal struggle with meaning becomes the laboratory for diagnosing modernity's spiritual sickness. The pastor's son who lost faith doesn't simply reject Christianity, but develops a systematic analysis of how religious and moral systems function as expressions of power, how they emerge from human needs, and why their collapse creates the nihilistic crisis of modern existence. Nietzsche's revolutionary contributions form a systematic response to nihilism. The genealogical method reveals the historical origins of our most cherished values. His diagnosis of nihilism identifies modernity's central problem, and his vision of human self-creation points beyond traditional morality. There are no moral phenomena at all, he argues in Beyond Good and Evil, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena. This insight wasn't relativism, but the foundation for a new kind of value creation, one that acknowledges the human origins of values whilst demanding we take responsibility for creating life-affirming alternatives. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Nietzsche is right about the collapse of traditional foundations, then understanding his alternative becomes essential for anyone seeking authentic existence in the modern world. We'll follow his evolution from early insights about tragedy and art through his systematic demolition of traditional values to his constructive vision of the Übermensch and eternal recurrence. Friedrich Nietzsche emerged from the very heart of Christian Germany, shaped by institutions designed to produce devoted servants of the faith. At Schulpforta, one of Prussia's most prestigious schools, young Friedrich excelled in biblical studies and classical philology, mastering the textual criticism that would later become his weapon against sacred foundations. His student essay, On the Origin of Evil, already questioned divine providence, yet his teachers praised his scholarly promise. Years later, he would reflect with characteristic irony, "I was brought up by excellent philologists who were also clergymen." The education meant to deepen Christian faith instead provided the very tools for its demolition. This biographical detail reveals something profound about Nietzsche's entire philosophical project. He possessed an insider's knowledge of Christianity, not the superficial familiarity of casual believers, but the deep textual and historical understanding of someone trained to defend the faith. When he eventually declared the death of God, he spoke with the authority of one who had inhabited Christian culture from within, who understood its promises and consolations, before rejecting them as life-denying illusions. Nietzsche's formation occurred during a crucial moment in European history, when traditional religious authority collided with scientific materialism and historical criticism. His generation witnessed Darwin's evolutionary theory undermining human specialness, Strauss's Life of Jesus exposing the mythical construction of Christian narrative and the rise of historical consciousness that made all values appear contingent rather than eternal. As Nietzsche observed, "We live in the age of comparison." Exposure to multiple cultures and historical periods had shattered the absoluteness of any single worldview. The psychological tension this created was immense. Intellectual honesty demanded abandoning comforting illusions, yet human beings require meaning and purpose. Nietzsche initially found refuge in Schopenhauer's pessimism, which offered an alternative to Christian consolation. He described discovering Schopenhauer, "Here I saw sickness and recovery, exile and refuge, hell and heaven." But Schopenhauer's solution, the denial of the will to live, eventually revealed itself as another form of the ascetic ideal, another flight from life's difficulties rather than their affirmation. What distinguished Nietzsche was his dual expertise in classical antiquity and modern culture. His deep knowledge of Greek civilization provided a critical perspective on Christian Europe. He could see what had been lost in Christianity's triumph. The Greeks faced the same fundamental problems of suffering and meaninglessness, but responded with tragic affirmation, rather than otherworldly escape. As he put it, the Greeks were superficial out of profundity, embracing life's surface beauty rather than fleeing into metaphysical depths. This comparative perspective uniquely qualified Nietzsche to diagnose modern spiritual sickness and point toward alternative possibilities. He stood simultaneously inside and outside European culture, understanding its deepest assumptions whilst possessing the historical knowledge to imagine different ways of being human. The pastor's son had become something unprecedented, a philosopher who could demolish the foundations of Christian civilization, not from ignorance, but from intimate knowledge of what those foundations actually supported. Part 1. The Birth of Philosophy from the Spirit of Art. Nietzsche's revolutionary insight in The Birth of Tragedy shattered conventional understanding of both art and existence itself. Greek tragedy, he discovered, emerged from the creative tension between two fundamental aesthetic drives: the Dionysian, representing intoxication, ecstasy, and the dissolution of individual boundaries, and the Apollonian, representing dream, beautiful illusion, and the creation of individual forms. The continuous development of art is bound up with the Apollonian and Dionysian duality, he declared. But this wasn't merely aesthetic theory. This was a diagnosis of existence itself. Life consists of the eternal struggle between chaos and order, destruction and creation, the one and the many. Through studying Greek art, Nietzsche had discovered the key to understanding both ancient greatness and modern decadence. The Dionysian revealed itself most powerfully in Greek religious festivals and tragic choruses, where participants experienced collective ecstasy that dissolved ordinary consciousness. This wasn't mere intoxication, but a profound form of wisdom that rational philosophy had tried to deny. Under Dionysian influence, humans glimpsed truths about existence that civilized thought concealed: that individual identity is ultimately illusory, that suffering and joy are inseparable aspects of the same reality, that life's essence is creative destructive, becoming rather than stable being. Under the charm of the Dionysian, not only is the union between man and man reaffirmed, Nietzsche observed, but nature, which has become alienated, hostile, or subjugated, celebrates once more her reconciliation with her lost son, man. In tragic choruses, Greek audiences experience temporary dissolution of their individual boundaries, accessing a non-rational wisdom about the fundamental character of existence itself. Greek tragedy achieved its unique greatness precisely by combining this Dionysian wisdom with Apollonian beauty, creating art that could affirm life despite, indeed, because of its tragic character. Tragic heroes like Oedipus and Prometheus embodied the Dionysian insight that individual existence necessarily involves suffering and destruction, whilst the beautiful form of tragedy transformed this suffering into aesthetic joy. Audiences experience catharsis not through moral purification, but through aesthetic affirmation. They learn to love fate, including its terrible aspects. This led Nietzsche to his crucial insight: only as an aesthetic phenomenon is existence and the world eternally justified. Tragedy taught its audiences that life's meaning emerges, not through rational understanding or moral justification, but through aesthetic transformation of suffering into beauty. This aesthetic discovery became the foundation of Nietzsche's entire philosophical project, by revealing that art can justify existence where reason fails. The revolutionary implication was clear. If life's meaning comes through aesthetic creation rather than rational understanding, then humans must become artists of their own existence. For it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified, he proclaimed, establishing a principle that would echo throughout his mature philosophy. The Übermensch would emerge as the human being who creates meaning through self-artistic creation, whilst eternal recurrence would represent the ultimate aesthetic affirmation of existence. Yet this discovery also posed the driving question of his philosophical development. If the Greeks achieved aesthetic justification through tragedy, how can modern humans achieve it after the collapse of tragic culture? Socrates stands as the most pivotal figure in Western intellectual history, yet Nietzsche reveals him not as philosophy's great liberator, but as its most dangerous seducer. The Athenian gadfly introduced a fatal equation that would poison European consciousness for over 2 millennia: the belief that reason leads to virtue, virtue to happiness, and knowledge to the good life. This seemingly innocent formula represents nothing less than the destruction of tragic wisdom, the moment when humanity chose theoretical comfort over instinctive truth. Before Socrates, Greek culture possessed something extraordinary: the capacity to affirm life despite its fundamental irrationality, suffering, and contradiction. Tragic art achieved this through aesthetic justification, making existence bearable not by explaining it away, but by transforming it into something beautiful and terrible. The great tragedians understood that life's deepest truths resist rational comprehension, that wisdom emerges from accepting rather than solving existence's essential mysteries. Socrates shattered this tragic equilibrium with his relentless demand for rational justification. Socrates, the dialectical hero of the Platonic drama, reminds us of the kindred nature of the Euripidean hero, who must defend his actions with arguments and counterarguments. Where Aeschylus and Sophocles had presented characters whose greatness transcended moral categories, Euripides, under Socratic influence, reduced his protagonists to debaters, forcing them to justify their passions through rational argument. The Dionysian chorus, that collective voice of instinctive wisdom, gave way to moral dialectic and intellectual analysis. This transformation reveals Socratic optimism's deeper character: the belief that existence can and should be rationally comprehensible. Suffering, according to this view, results from ignorance. Wisdom eliminates the need for tragic affirmation. The examined life automatically becomes the good life. Such optimism assumes that reality's fundamental structure aligns with human reason, that what appears chaotic and meaningless merely awaits proper understanding. This is the new antithesis: the Dionysiac and the Socratic, and the artwork of Greek tragedy was destroyed by it. The destruction was thorough and irreversible. Socratic rationalism appealed irresistibly to those who could not bear life's fundamental irrationality, offering intellectual control where tragic wisdom demanded acceptance. The promise proved seductive. Through dialectical inquiry, human beings could penetrate existence's deepest secrets, achieve moral certainty, and construct lives of rational happiness. Yet this Socratic turn created something unprecedented: theoretical culture's domination over instinctive wisdom. The rise of systematic philosophy, empirical science, and moral rationalism followed inevitably from the Socratic premise, while theoretical culture achieved remarkable practical successes: technological mastery, logical precision, ethical systems. It simultaneously undermined the conditions necessary for cultural greatness and individual flourishing. Nietzsche identifies the theoretical man, who believes that thought, using the thread of logic, can penetrate the deepest abysses of being. This figure represents Western civilization's defining type: the scholar and philosopher who approaches existence as a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be lived. Theoretical culture's triumph seemed complete, yet it contained a fatal contradiction. The very success of rational explanation in controlling nature made existence appear mechanical and meaningless. The historical consequences unfold through Nietzsche's genealogy of Western rationalism. Plato's realm of forms represents the first great elaboration of Socratic premises, positing a true world of eternal ideas that renders this world of appearances secondary and derivative. Christianity inherited and popularized this structure. Christianity is Platonism for the people, promising that earthly suffering finds justification in heavenly reward. Modern science completes the trajectory. explaining natural phenomena through mechanical causation, while simultaneously draining them of inherent meaning. Each stage intensified the original Socratic error. The assumption that this world requires justification by appeal to some truer reality. Nietzsche's earliest and perhaps most radical insight emerged from a simple yet devastating observation. Existence contains suffering so profound that it seems to demand justification, yet no rational argument or moral framework can provide it. Traditional philosophy had sought to explain suffering away through metaphysical theories or compensate for it through promises of otherworldly reward. Christianity offered salvation beyond this world, whilst Socratic rationalism promised that knowledge would eliminate suffering through understanding. Both approaches, Nietzsche realized, fundamentally denied life by requiring it to answer to external standards. Only aesthetic experience, he discovered, could make existence bearable without requiring false consolations or moral justifications. Art reveals life's self-justifying character through the creation and destruction of beautiful forms, mirroring existence's own creative destructive process. When we witness tragedy, we do not demand that the suffering be explained or compensated. We find it beautiful precisely because it transforms pain into aesthetic experience without denying the reality of that pain. The tragic hero's destruction becomes meaningful, not through moral vindication, but through the beauty of the form itself. This aesthetic transformation occurs without reference to any standard beyond the phenomenon itself. As Nietzsche declared in his foundational insight, we have our highest dignity in our significance as works of art, for it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified. Consider how aesthetic experience operates when confronting human suffering. A great work of art does not explain away pain or promise future compensation for present agony. Instead, it transforms suffering into beauty without denying or diminishing the suffering itself. The aesthetic phenomenon accomplishes what neither rational argument nor moral teaching can achieve. It makes life worth living precisely as it is, without requiring external validation or metaphysical guarantees. This represents the alternative to both Socratic rationalism and Christian otherworldliness. A this-worldly affirmation that needs no cosmic authorization. The aesthetic phenomenon provides the key to understanding existence as eternal creative play rather than moral drama or rational system. Life creates forms not for any purpose beyond the creation itself, destroys them, not from malice, but from creative necessity, and begins anew in endless experimentation. The world operates according to artistic rather than logical principles, generating appearances not to reveal some hidden truth, but for the sheer joy of creation itself. As Nietzsche recognized, the existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. Artistic creation mirrors cosmic creation in essential ways. Both involve the imposition of form on chaos, the celebration of appearance over truth, and the affirmation of becoming over being. The artist does not create to communicate moral lessons or reveal metaphysical realities, but to give form to creative impulses that demand expression. Similarly, existence itself creates and destroys forms in an endless play of appearances that serves no purpose beyond the play itself. This aesthetic understanding dissolves the traditional problems of philosophy by revealing them to be based on false premises about existence, requiring external justification. This early aesthetic insight anticipates Nietzsche's mature philosophy of self-creation and value creation. The connection runs directly from the artist who creates beautiful works to the philosopher who creates new values, from the tragic hero who affirms fate to the Übermensch who loves his destiny, the creative principle that justifies existence aesthetically becomes the foundation for human self-transformation, as Nietzsche would later declare. One must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star. The development moves naturally from aesthetic justification of existence to the imperative that humans become artists of their own lives, creating meaning through style, beauty, and creative power, rather than conformity to external standards. If existence is justified only as aesthetic phenomenon, then the highest human possibility lies in aesthetic self-creation. The aesthetic criterion provides the foundation for evaluating different forms of life and culture according to their creative power rather than their moral virtue or rational coherence. This vision carries profound cultural implications. Part 2. The Untimely Insights. Nietzsche's early diagnosis of modernity's fundamental contradiction strikes at the heart of what he saw as contemporary civilization's most peculiar malady. In his Untimely Meditations, he identified a devastating paradox. The more historical knowledge modern culture accumulates, the less capable it becomes of genuine creative action. This creates what he termed the historical disease, a paralyzing self-consciousness, where every possible deed appears already accomplished, every value already relativized by historical comparison. We moderns have nothing of our own, Nietzsche observed with surgical precision. We only become worthy of notice by filling ourselves to overflowing with foreign ages, customs, arts, philosophies, religions, and knowledge. This overflowing creates not richness, but impotence. The modern individual, stuffed with the achievements of every epoch, finds himself unable to act with the naive confidence necessary for genuine creation. Every gesture seems borrowed, every idea derivative, every value contingent upon historical circumstance. Consider Nietzsche's concrete example of German educational institutions, which he knew intimately from his own experience as a classical philologist. These institutions produce scholars of extraordinary erudition who can discourse knowledgeably about every aspect of Greek tragedy, Renaissance art, or medieval philosophy, yet remain utterly incapable of creating anything genuinely their own. They know everything about culture, but cannot themselves create culture. They become walking encyclopedias rather than living forces. This distinction between genuine culture and mere civilization forms the cornerstone of Nietzsche's early cultural criticism. Genuine culture, as he understood it, grows organically from the soil of a particular people's deepest instincts. It is aristocratic in the sense that it produces exceptional individuals. Most crucially, it is life-enhancing. It increases human power, creativity, and the capacity for noble action. Culture is above all unity of artistic style, in all the expressions of the life of a people. Nietzsche declared, "This unity cannot be manufactured through institutions or imposed through education. It must emerge from shared instincts, common values, and a collective vision of human excellence that permeates every aspect of social life." Modern civilization, by contrast, is mechanical rather than organic. It operates through institutional structures that can be replicated anywhere, imposed upon any population. It is democratic in the worst sense. It levels all distinctions, reduces all values to matters of personal preference, and treats all cultural achievements as equally valid consumer choices. Rather than enhancing life, it diminishes human beings by reducing them to useful functions within vast bureaucratic systems. The ancient Greeks possessed genuine culture because they created from their own vital instincts. They didn't look backward to some golden age for inspiration. They looked within themselves and forward toward their own ideal of human excellence. Modern Europeans, however, possess only civilization they imitate, systematize, and catalogue the achievements of others whilst remaining creatively sterile themselves. The historical sense, which should be humanity's crowning achievement, becomes instead its greatest burden. The historical sense makes its servants passive and retrospective. Nietzsche diagnosed, instead of using historical knowledge as a tool for creative action, modern individuals become paralyzed by the sheer weight of precedent. Every possible action appears already accomplished by someone else, in some other time and place. Nietzsche illustrated this paradox through his famous comparison between humans and animals. A cow lives happily in the eternal present, neither burdened by memory of yesterday's grass nor anxious about tomorrow's weather. The human being, by contrast, carries the entire weight of historical consciousness, memory of the past, anticipation of the future, awareness of mortality, knowledge of cultural relativity. This knowledge, which should make humans superior to animals, threatens instead to make them inferior by destroying their capacity for spontaneous, life-affirming action. The symptoms of this cultural sickness manifest everywhere in contemporary institutions. Universities produce specialists who know more and more about less and less, losing sight of culture's synthetic, life-enhancing function. The press floods society with information, whilst providing no wisdom about how to live. Modern education produces exactly what it intends to produce: useful specialists, obedient citizens, and efficient functionaries who serve the machinery of the state rather than the higher aspirations of culture. Nietzsche recognized this as no accident, but as the logical outcome of institutions that rest, in his words, on the principle that one must be useful above all. The German universities of his time trained scholars to contribute incrementally to existing knowledge, to master established methodologies, and to reproduce the intellectual frameworks they inherited. They produced historians who catalogued the past, philologists who analyzed ancient texts, and scientists who expanded technical understanding, all valuable in their way, but none capable of questioning the fundamental assumptions underlying their disciplines or creating genuinely new perspectives on human existence. This educational crisis reflects a deeper spiritual poverty. Modern society has lost the capacity to recognize and cultivate human greatness because it no longer believes in the possibility of exceptional individuals who might transcend conventional categories of thought and value. Instead, it seeks to level all differences, to make education democratic and accessible, to ensure that everyone receives the same standardized formation. The result is a culture of mediocrity that systematically eliminates the conditions under which authentic genius might emerge. Educational institutions become factories for producing interchangeable parts in the social mechanism, rather than gardens for cultivating unique forms of human excellence. Against this backdrop, Nietzsche found in Schopenhauer an exemplar of what authentic philosophy might look like. Schopenhauer represented the philosopher who lived according to his own insights rather than social conventions, who served as a physician of culture, diagnosing spiritual sickness rather than simply contributing to scholarly discourse. In his essay, Schopenhauer as Educator, Nietzsche celebrated not Schopenhauer's specific doctrines, but his example, the example of intellectual honesty, independence from social pressures, and commitment to truth, regardless of consequences. Schopenhauer taught not through transmitting information, but through demonstrating what it means to think independently, to follow arguments wherever they lead, and to maintain philosophical integrity, in a world that rewards conformity and compromise. The power of Schopenhauer's example lay in his psychological penetration. He understood that authentic educators transform students not by filling their minds with content, but by awakening their capacity for self-creation and independent thought. Schopenhauer showed how a philosopher might diagnose the illusions that sustain conventional life, whilst maintaining rigorous intellectual standards. He demonstrated that serious philosophy requires the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about human existence, including the recognition that most of what people consider meaningful is actually driven by unconscious biological drives and social conditioning. This kind of honesty, Nietzsche realized, was precisely what modern education systematically avoided. Yet Schopenhauer's pessimistic solution, the denial of the will to live through aesthetic contemplation and ascetic withdrawal, could not be the final answer. While Schopenhauer correctly diagnosed life's suffering and apparent meaninglessness, his prescription of escape represented another form of life denial, albeit more intellectually honest than Christian otherworldliness. Nietzsche began to suspect that Schopenhauer's philosophy, for all its penetrating analysis, remained trapped within the same fundamental framework that it criticized. It sought redemption from life, rather than redemption of life. Schopenhauer's ascetic ideal, however sophisticated, still implied that existence itself was a mistake requiring correction. This recognition led Nietzsche to a crucial insight. What if pleasure and displeasure were so tied together that whoever wanted to have as much as possible of one must also have as much as possible of the other? Perhaps the problem lay not in life's tragic character, but in the assumption that tragedy required escape. Perhaps genuine philosophy needed to find a way to affirm life, including its suffering, rather than seeking refuge from life's fundamental nature. Wagner initially appeared to solve the riddle of cultural renewal that had haunted Nietzsche's early thinking. Here was an artist who seemed capable of creating authentic German art that could rival ancient Greek culture and inspire genuine cultural transformation. Wagner's music dramas represented a revolutionary synthesis, bringing together all the arts into what he called the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. This wasn't merely aesthetic innovation. It promised to restore the communal, religious function that Greek tragedy had served for ancient audiences, but now for modern German culture. Nietzsche's early enthusiasm burned bright with this possibility. Wagner represented the rebirth of German myth and the promise of a new culture emerging from the ashes of Christian civilization. The Bayreuth Festival embodied this vision concretely, a sacred space for art that could compete directly with Christian churches and academic institutions for the spiritual allegiance of modern people. Here was practical philosophy in action, not merely theoretical speculation about cultural renewal, but an actual attempt to create the conditions for authentic cultural experience. Yet this initial promise contained the seeds of its own corruption. Nietzsche's growing recognition of Wagner's limitations emerged through careful analysis of the nationalist and romantic elements woven throughout Wagnerian art. Wagner's appeal to German mythology and his vision of art as national renewal revealed a fundamental danger in any program of cultural renewal: the temptation to escape present challenges through mythological fantasy rather than creating genuinely new possibilities for human existence. The psychological insight proved devastating. Wagner's art, Nietzsche came to realize, appealed to the same escapist instincts as Christianity itself. Wagner's art is sick, he would later write. The problems he presents on the stage, all of them problems of hysteria, the convulsive nature of his affects, his overexcited sensibility. The music dramas offered redemption through aesthetic experience, rather than demanding the courage to create new values. They provided elaborate emotional catharsis whilst avoiding the fundamental question of what values could sustain authentic existence in the modern world. This recognition forced a deeper insight about the nature of cultural renewal itself. Genuine culture cannot be artificially created through programs, movements, or institutional initiatives. It must emerge from exceptional individuals who transcend their historical moment through creative power that transforms the very conditions of existence. Cultural renewal requires not the revival of past forms, whether Greek tragedy or German myth, but the creation of entirely new forms appropriate to modern conditions. One must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star, Nietzsche realized. Wagner's attempt to create culture through institutional means, through the careful orchestration of the Bayreuth experience, missed the essential point. Culture emerges from individual creativity that cannot be systematized, programmed, or manufactured through even the most sophisticated artistic techniques. The festival format, the mythological content, the musical innovations, all remained external to the fundamental question of what kind of human being could create authentic culture. The Wagner experience taught Nietzsche that the question of cultural renewal is fundamentally the question of human transformation. This shifts the entire focus from external cultural forms to internal psychological and spiritual conditions. Instead of asking what institutions or artworks we need, the question becomes, what kind of human being could bear the full weight of modern consciousness whilst maintaining creative power? What does not kill me makes me stronger. This insight emerged directly from recognizing that cultural renewal requires individuals capable of facing nihilistic implications without retreating into comforting fantasies. Neither traditional religion nor romantic art can provide the foundation for authentic culture. The question becomes whether human transformation itself could make genuine cultural creativity possible, and what such transformation would demand. Part 3. The Free Spirit's Awakening. Human, all too human, marks Nietzsche's revolutionary methodological shift from metaphysical speculation to psychological analysis. Where his earlier work sought to understand culture through grand aesthetic and metaphysical categories, he now approaches human beliefs, values, and behaviors as products of natural and historical forces rather than expressions of eternal truths. This approach treats philosophy, religion, and morality not as systems to be refuted or defended, but as symptoms to be diagnosed. There are no eternal facts, he declares, just as there are no absolute truths. What emerges is what he calls historical philosophizing, a genealogical method that traces how human values and institutions actually developed, rather than assuming they reflect timeless principles. Consider how this method transforms our understanding of religious experience. Rather than debating whether God exists or whether religious claims are true, Nietzsche examines religious experience as the result of specific psychological needs and social conditions. The mystic's ecstasy becomes a compensation for powerlessness. The saint's self-denial reveals a disguised form of self-assertion. The believer's faith emerges from the terror of meaninglessness. This isn't dismissal but scientific investigation, understanding religion as a human phenomenon with natural causes and effects. This psychological analysis yields shocking discoveries about the origins of our highest values and noblest sentiments. What we consider most sacred: love, justice, truth, beauty, emerged from mundane sources. Survival needs, power struggles, social cooperation, and psychological compensation. Altruism develops from enlightened self-interest. Moral rules crystallize from practical social needs. Religious beliefs compensate for psychological weaknesses. the most spiritual men as the strongest. Nietzsche observes, find their happiness where others would find their destruction. This isn't cynical reductionism, but honest recognition of human nature's complexity. The implications prove liberating and terrifying. Once we see how values were created by humans under specific conditions, we can imagine creating different values under different conditions. The psychological approach reveals the human-made character of everything we considered sacred or self-evident, dissolving the distinction between natural and artificial, eternal and historical. Man has gradually become a fantastic animal. Nietzsche recognizes that has to fulfill one more condition of existence than any other animal. Man has to believe, to know, from time to time why he exists. If humans created their current values, they can create new ones, more appropriate to their actual needs and possibilities. Yet this creates a new problem. If all our values are human creations, rather than discoveries of eternal truths, how do we distinguish between healthy and sick, noble and base forms of human life? Psychological analysis provides the tools by examining what psychological types different values serve and what effects they produce. The emerging criterion becomes, what does not kill me makes me stronger? Values that enhance life, promote growth, and enable creative self-expression prove healthier than those that diminish, restrict, or deny human potential. This analysis must eventually turn reflexive. The psychologist must examine his own motives and values, leading to the crucial question, what kind of human being is capable of this radical self-examination without losing the capacity for creative action? The free spirit emerges as one who can face the human-made character of all values whilst retaining the strength to create new ones. A psychological type, capable of both devastating honesty and constructive imagination. The free spirit emerges as philosophy's truest wanderer, an intellectual nomad who recognizes that genuine thinking requires perpetual movement. Nietzsche understood that the moment we settle into any fixed system, creed, or even philosophical position, we begin to lose the very capacity that makes independent thought possible. This nomadism operates on multiple levels, simultaneously geographical, intellectual, and spiritual. When Nietzsche declared, "I am a wanderer and a mountain climber. I do not like the plains, and it seems I cannot sit still for long," he revealed something essential about the methodology of free thinking itself. His own restless movement through European cities from Basel to Sils Maria, from Nice to Turin, mirrors the intellectual restlessness that prevents the mind from calcifying into comfortable habits of thought. The plains represent more than geographical flatness. They symbolize the spiritual stagnation that comes from remaining too long in familiar territory. The free spirit must maintain this perpetual motion, not from mere personal preference, but from methodological necessity. Intellectual growth requires the constant encounter with new perspectives, new challenges, new ways of seeing that can only emerge through sustained displacement from our inherited certainties. This nomadism reveals its deepest significance in Nietzsche's revolutionary approach to truth itself. Rather than seeking dogmatic adherence to single viewpoints, the free spirit recognizes that genuine understanding emerges from the ability to see from multiple angles, to synthesize different perspectives, whilst avoiding the trap of shallow relativism. Nietzsche articulates this with characteristic precision. There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing, and the more effects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be. The free spirit must cultivate what Nietzsche calls intellectual probity, the capacity to understand and even temporarily adopt viewpoints he ultimately rejects. This demands extraordinary psychological flexibility, the ability to inhabit different worldviews without losing oneself in them to maintain intellectual honesty, whilst exploring ideas that challenge one's deepest convictions. The danger lies not in this flexibility itself, but in the possibility of falling into relativistic indifference, where all perspectives become equally valid and therefore equally meaningless. Yet this intellectual nomadism generates its own profound tensions. Solitude becomes necessary for independent thinking precisely because social conformity pressures constantly threaten to corrupt the free spirit's intellectual honesty. The crowd demands agreement, consensus. Genuine thinking requires stepping outside these pressures, creating space for ideas to develop according to their own internal logic. Nietzsche recognized this tension with characteristic clarity. In solitude, the solitary devours himself. In the multitude devours him. Now choose. The free spirit faces an impossible choice between two forms of destruction. Isolation enables clear thinking but risks disconnection from life itself, whilst social engagement provides vitality but threatens intellectual corruption. Nietzsche's own experience demonstrates this dilemma. His increasing isolation became the price of intellectual independence, yet this very isolation raised new dangers. Pure criticism without constructive vision leads to spiritual sterility. The free spirit who becomes merely critical, who can only tear down without building up, ultimately serves nihilism rather than life. This recognition forced Nietzsche to confront a crucial question. How can the free spirit maintain intellectual honesty whilst avoiding the nihilistic consequences of unlimited skepticism? The very success of critical analysis threatens to undermine the conditions necessary for creative action and value creation. The intellectual nomad discovers that perpetual movement, whilst necessary for escaping inherited prejudices, cannot constitute an end in itself. Nietzsche's insight that, when one has not had a good father, one must create one, applies equally to values, meaning, and the foundations of human flourishing. The free spirit must somehow move beyond pure criticism toward the creation of new possibilities. But this requires resources that critical analysis alone cannot provide. In Daybreak, Nietzsche embarks upon what he calls his campaign against morality, not against particular moral rules, but against the very idea that moral judgments express universal truths rather than particular perspectives. His systematic questioning reveals something unsettling. Our most cherished moral convictions, the ones that feel most self-evidently right, emerge from specific historical conditions and serve particular interests rather than reflecting eternal principles discovered by reason or divine revelation. Consider how radically different cultures moralize completely different behaviors. What one society considers the height of virtue, another condemns as vice. The warrior's honor that ancient Greeks celebrated becomes Christian humility's opposite. The merchant's profit-seeking that medieval Christianity denounced becomes Protestant capitalism's divine calling. The individual autonomy that modernity prizes becomes traditional community's destruction. These aren't merely different applications of the same underlying moral truth. They represent fundamentally different ways of organizing human values around different conceptions of what makes life worth living. Nietzsche's genealogical insight cuts deeper still. There are no moral phenomena at all, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena. the same actions, say, taking another's life, can be murder or heroism, crime or duty, sin or sacrifice, depending entirely on the interpretive framework through which we view it. The moral judgment doesn't discover some inherent property of the action itself, but rather expresses the values, interests, and psychological needs of those making the judgment. What we experience as moral certainty reflects not the action's objective moral character, but our own unconscious commitment to particular ways of evaluating human behavior. This recognition that morality has a history, that what we consider moral varies not just across cultures, but across epochs within the same culture, undermines moral certainty in ways that create what Nietzsche calls dangerous freedom. Historical consciousness reveals that moral systems are human creations that served specific purposes under particular conditions rather than eternal truths waiting to be discovered. The moral earth too has its antipodes, he observes. The antipodes too have their right to exist. Once we see that our deepest moral convictions are contingent products of historical development, we can no longer take them for granted as absolute guides to action. The psychological impact proves profound. The person who genuinely grasps that their moral framework represents one possibility among many, that their ancestors lived by completely different moral systems, and their descendants might live by others, still faces a crisis of authority. If the moral rules that have guided human behavior for centuries or millennia are revealed as human inventions rather than discoveries, on what basis can we continue to make value judgments or life decisions? The traditional sources of moral authority, divine command, natural law, rational insight, cultural tradition, all lose their compelling power once we see them as historically contingent rather than eternally valid. This creates both liberation and terror. Liberation, because we're freed from inherited constraints that may no longer serve human flourishing under current conditions. Terror, because we lose inherited guidance that provided clear direction for navigating life's complexities. The free spirit stands at a crossroads between nihilistic relativism, the conclusion that all values are equally arbitrary and therefore meaningless, and the possibility of creating new values based on different criteria altogether. Nietzsche recognizes the stakes. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. The dangerous freedom created by moral skepticism poses the fundamental question: if traditional moral certainties dissolve, how do we avoid the collapse into meaninglessness whilst maintaining the capacity for decisive action and strong evaluation? How do we acknowledge the human-made character of all values without concluding that no values are worth affirming? Yet this dangerous freedom is actually the precondition for authentic human existence. Only when we stop taking our values for granted can we begin to create values consciously and responsibly. Part 4. The Gay Science of Joyful Wisdom. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. With these words, spoken by a madman in the marketplace, Nietzsche delivered what may be the most consequential philosophical diagnosis of the modern age. This isn't celebration, but recognition, the identification of the most profound cultural crisis in Western history, the collapse of the transcendent foundation that had given meaning to European civilization. For over a millennium, the madman appears in broad daylight carrying a lantern, searching for God amongst people who no longer believe but haven't grasped what their unbelief means. He finds only mockery from those who think themselves beyond such primitive concerns. But the madman recognizes something they cannot. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Nietzsche saw himself as announcing a cultural transformation whose consequences hadn't yet been realized, whose full impact remained hidden even from those who considered themselves enlightened. The death of God means the collapse of any transcendent source of meaning, value, and purpose. Modern intellectual developments, evolutionary theory, historical criticism of religious texts, scientific materialism have rendered traditional religious worldviews intellectually untenable for honest thinkers. The careful, methodical advance of scientific thinking has systematically undermined every supernatural claim, every appeal to divine authority, every metaphysical comfort that once anchored human existence. Yet Nietzsche understood that intellectual demolition doesn't immediately transform lived experience. After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead. But given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. The psychological and cultural structures built on religious foundations persist long after their intellectual basis has crumbled. This creates a dangerous gap between what people believe intellectually and how they continue to live practically. The consequences of this gap manifest as nihilism, the recognition that existence has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why? Finds no answer. When the transcendent source of all values disappears, the values themselves lose their compelling power. Moral obligations become arbitrary preferences. Life purposes become personal whims. The entire structure of meaning that once made existence bearable begins to collapse. Nietzsche diagnosed the cultural symptoms of this collapse: the rise of pessimism, the appeal of various forms of escapism, the desperate search for substitute religions in nationalism, socialism, and scientism. Modern life exhibits a general sense of meaninglessness, a spiritual exhaustion that manifests as both frantic activity and underlying despair. People busy themselves with careers, causes, and distractions while sensing that none of it ultimately matters. This nihilistic crisis becomes the necessary prelude to genuine cultural renewal. The old foundations must be completely cleared away before new ones can be built. The death of God, whilst initially terrifying, actually opens unprecedented possibilities for human self-creation and authentic existence, but only for those with sufficient courage to embrace this responsibility. The fundamental question emerges: how do we live and create meaning in a world without inherent purpose or divine guarantee? This question drives Nietzsche's mature philosophy, the search for life affirmation that doesn't depend on metaphysical consolation. If humans can no longer receive meaning from transcendent sources, they must create meaning through their own creative power. The death of God transforms from catastrophe into opportunity, but only for those prepared to become who they truly are. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more"? Nietzsche poses this haunting question in The Gay Science, presenting what he calls the greatest weight, a thought so profound it threatens to crush or transform anyone who truly grasps its implications. The demon continues, "There will be nothing new. Every pain and every joy, every thought and sigh must come back to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider, this moonlight between the trees, even this moment and yourself, all must return eternally." This isn't primarily a cosmological doctrine, about the actual structure of time. Nietzsche offers eternal recurrence as a psychological test, a thought experiment designed to reveal the deepest truth about how we relate to existence itself. The demon's challenge forces a brutal confrontation. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? The question cuts to the core of whether we genuinely affirm life or secretly harbor resentment against existence. Most people, Nietzsche suggests, would be horrified by this prospect. The thought of repeating every moment of suffering, every failure, every tedious afternoon, every moment of shame or regret, all exactly as they occurred, without the possibility of change or improvement, would seem like the cruelest possible curse. We typically endure life's difficulties by consoling ourselves with hopes of better times ahead, with dreams of redemption or escape, with the belief that our suffering serves some higher purpose. Eternal recurrence strips away all such consolations. The thought experiment demands unconditional acceptance of everything that has happened and will happen. No longer can we justify our existence by appealing to future rewards, cosmic justice, or transcendent meaning. We cannot comfort ourselves with the notion that our suffering will eventually be redeemed or that justice will ultimately prevail. There is only this life, repeated infinitely, exactly as it has been and will be. The question becomes, can you love your life enough to will its eternal repetition without any alteration whatsoever? This psychological test separates those capable of genuine life affirmation from those who secretly resent existence and seek escape through various forms of otherworldliness. The person who would curse the demon reveals their fundamental hostility to life as it actually is. They may claim to love life, but their horror at eternal recurrence exposes their deeper wish that life were different, better, more meaningful than it is. They affirm life conditionally, only insofar as it meets their standards or fulfills their expectations. But Nietzsche envisions a different response, one that requires a radical transformation of our entire relationship to existence. This is the development of amor fati, love of fate, that can embrace not just the pleasant aspects of existence, but everything, including suffering, loss, and apparent meaninglessness. His formula for greatness becomes that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. A celebration of existence that finds beauty and meaning in life as an aesthetic phenomenon, rather than judging it by external moral or metaphysical standards. Such affirmation cannot be achieved through rational argument alone. It requires a fundamental shift in perspective, a transformation from resentment to gratitude, from judgment to celebration. The person capable of saying, "You are a god" to the demon has moved beyond seeking external justification for existence. They have learned to create meaning without requiring cosmic authorization, to find joy without needing universal validation. Eternal recurrence thus serves as Nietzsche's ultimate anti-metaphysical thought. It offers no escape, no redemption, no transcendent meaning, only the demand for total affirmation of existence as it is. This eliminates all the consolations that traditional philosophy and religion offered. There is no better world awaiting us, no ultimate justice that will set things right, no cosmic purpose that justifies our suffering. There is only this world, this life, this moment, repeated eternally. This is simultaneously the most terrible and most liberating thought possible. Nietzsche's concept of amor fati represents perhaps the most radical psychological transformation he ever proposed. not merely accepting what happens to us, but actively loving our fate in its entirety. This goes far beyond Stoic resignation, which counsels enduring what cannot be changed. Amor fati demands that we embrace everything that has happened and will happen as necessary elements in existence's total pattern. I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things, Nietzsche wrote, then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. This isn't passive acceptance, but active affirmation, choosing our suffering, willing our failures, celebrating even our losses as indispensable threads in the tapestry of our becoming. The psychological revolution this requires cannot be overstated. Every experience of pain, disappointment, or tragedy must be transformed from an occasion for resentment into an opportunity for deeper life affirmation. When we love our fate, we stop dividing our experiences into those we wish had happened and those we wish hadn't. Instead, we recognize that our entire existence, including its darkest moments, has been necessary for creating who we are. This represents the ultimate expression of human freedom. Not the ability to control what happens to us, but the power to choose our attitude toward everything that happens. From this foundation emerges what Nietzsche calls joyful wisdom, the transformation of the free spirit into a philosopher who can laugh at existence whilst taking it with ultimate seriousness. This laughter isn't frivolous but profound. Born from the deepest understanding of life's tragic character. Perhaps I know best why man alone laughs, Nietzsche observed. He alone suffers so deeply that he had to invent laughter. Joyful wisdom represents the synthesis of intellectual honesty about existence's difficulties with aesthetic affirmation of its beauty and creative potential. The philosopher of joyful wisdom has moved beyond both optimistic denial of life's harsh realities and pessimistic surrender to them. Genuine joy emerges not from the absence of suffering, but from the transformation of suffering into creative power. This is why Nietzsche could declare, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." Every obstacle becomes material for self-creation. Every setback, an opportunity for deeper understanding. Every loss, a chance to discover new possibilities for affirmation. Joyful wisdom combines the free spirit's critical intelligence with a capacity for life affirmation that doesn't depend on illusions or false consolations. This represents Nietzsche's solution to nihilism, not the discovery of inherent meaning in existence, but the creation of meaning through unconditional affirmation itself. When we can say yes to life without requiring guarantees about its ultimate purpose or value, we transcend the need for metaphysical comfort that has driven so much human philosophy and religion. The aesthetic dimension proves crucial here. Joyful wisdom treats existence as a work of art, to be appreciated for its beauty rather than judged by moral or rational standards. This creates an entirely new relationship to truth, not as something that must be comforting or practically useful, but as something that can be affirmed even when it reveals existence's fundamental groundlessness. The philosopher of joyful wisdom can contemplate the abyss and laugh, not because the abyss isn't real, but because even the abyss contributes to the magnificent spectacle of existence. This transformation opens new possibilities for human greatness. Once we abandon the need for cosmic authorization and external validation, we become free to create genuinely new values and possibilities. Amor fati and joyful wisdom create the psychological conditions necessary for authentic creativity. Only those who can affirm existence unconditionally possess the strength to create from abundance rather than neediness. One must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star, Nietzsche proclaimed, recognizing that creative power emerges from our ability to transform even chaos into beauty. This points toward his emerging vision of the Übermensch, the human being who has achieved this unconditional life affirmation and can therefore create new values from strength rather than weakness. Joyful wisdom represents the psychological foundation for this transformation, the inner condition that makes possible a complete revaluation of values based on life affirmation rather than resentment. Part 5. Beyond Good and Evil. The will to truth drives every philosopher, yet Nietzsche exposes this seemingly noble pursuit as something far more complex and troubling. What philosophers present as pure rational discovery actually masks a deeper will to power the desire to impose their values on reality rather than uncover eternal truths. This revelation strikes at the heart of philosophy's most fundamental assumption: that human reason can transcend personal prejudice to grasp objective reality. Nietzsche demonstrates that philosophical systems inevitably reflect their creators' psychological needs and cultural prejudices rather than pure rational insight. Consider Plato's theory of forms, which philosophers have long celebrated as the triumph of abstract thinking over material limitation. Nietzsche reveals this theory as expressing Plato's aristocratic disdain for the material world. The philosopher king's need to establish a realm where his intellectual superiority translates into absolute authority. The eternal forms aren't discoveries about reality's structure. They're projections of aristocratic values onto the cosmos itself. Christian philosophy provides an even more striking example. Theologians present their systematic doctrines as revelations of divine truth, yet Nietzsche shows how these systems actually systematize resentment against life itself. The Christian emphasis on otherworldly salvation, the degradation of earthly existence, the elevation of suffering over joy. These aren't insights into ultimate reality, but expressions of a particular psychological type that cannot bear life's uncertainty and pain. The philosopher creates a systematic justification for his own weakness and calls it divine wisdom. Modern rationalism continues this pattern with different content but identical structure. Philosophers like Descartes and Kant present their systems as pure products of logical necessity, yet Nietzsche reveals how rationalism expresses the bourgeois need for predictability and control, the demand that reality conform to logical categories, the insistence that moral laws must be universal and absolute. These reflect the merchant class's requirement for stable, calculable conditions rather than genuine insights into existence's nature. This analysis exposes the fundamental problem of dogmatism in philosophical thinking. Philosophers present their personal prejudices as universal truths discovered by pure reason, assuming that reality must conform to human logical categories and moral preferences. They cannot acknowledge that human thinking might be fundamentally perspectival, because such acknowledgement would undermine their entire enterprise. As Nietzsche observes, every great philosophy consists of the confession of its originator and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. The psychological mechanism underlying dogmatism becomes clear through this analysis. Dogmatic philosophers cannot bear the uncertainty and groundlessness of existence, so they create systematic illusions of absolute knowledge and eternal truth. These illusions provide the security that reality itself doesn't offer, but they exact a terrible price: the denial of life's actual character. The philosopher who insists on absolute moral categories must ignore the complex, contradictory nature of human experience. The thinker who demands logical certainty must close his eyes to existence's fundamental ambiguity. Nietzsche's analysis of opposite values reveals how traditional philosophical categories distort rather than illuminate reality. Philosophy has always organized itself around absolute oppositions: good versus evil, truth versus falsehood, reason versus passion, spirit versus matter. Yet these oppositions falsify experience by forcing complex relationships into simplistic either-or categories. Reality involves more sophisticated relationships than simple oppositions allow. Life actually requires the synthesis of apparently contradictory elements, rather than the choice between absolute alternatives. Good requires evil for definition. Without the possibility of wrongdoing, moral choice becomes meaningless. Truth emerges from creative tension with error, without the risk of falsehood. Genuine discovery becomes impossible. Strength develops through overcoming weakness without resistance. Power cannot manifest itself. The philosopher who insists on absolute oppositions misses these dynamic relationships and creates static categories that bear no resemblance to lived experience. This dissolution of traditional oppositions reveals that there are no moral phenomena at all, but only moral interpretations of phenomena. Free spirits represent Nietzsche's vision of philosophers of the future thinkers, who have liberated themselves from inherited moral and intellectual categories through experimental rather than dogmatic approaches to fundamental questions. These are not mere skeptics who doubt everything, but creative investigators who treat all beliefs, values, and systems as hypotheses to be tested, rather than truths to be defended. Nietzsche captures their essence when he writes, "We, however, want to become those we are human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves." This experimental approach represents a methodological revolution in philosophy. Instead of seeking eternal foundations or absolute truths, experimental philosophers explore what different ways of thinking and valuing make possible for human existence. They ask not whether a belief corresponds to reality, but what kind of life it enables or prevents. This transforms philosophy from the discovery of truth to the creation of new possibilities, a shift that places creative power at the heart of intellectual work. Yet, experimental thinking demands extraordinary courage. It requires the psychological strength to live with uncertainty whilst maintaining creative power. Nietzsche measures intellectual courage precisely by this capacity. The strength of a spirit should be measured according to how much of the truth one could still barely endure, or to put it more clearly, to what degree one would require it to be thinned down, shrouded, sweetened, blunted, falsified. The experimental thinker must bear the anxiety of groundlessness without retreating into comfortable dogmas or nihilistic despair. This courage comes at a personal cost. Experimental thinking demands the willingness to abandon cherished beliefs when they prove inadequate, to live without the comfort of absolute certainties, and to take responsibility for the consequences of one's intellectual experiments. It means treating one's own deepest convictions as provisional, subject to revision or rejection based on their effects on human flourishing. But experimentation alone proves insufficient. Without some guiding principle, it degenerates into mere skepticism or relativism, destroying old values without creating anything positive or life-enhancing. Nietzsche recognizes this limitation. Experimental thinking must be guided by some criterion for evaluating different possibilities, even if that criterion cannot be grounded in eternal truth. His insight points toward a new standard. The question is not whether a belief is true, but whether it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps species-cultivating. This creates a fundamental tension within experimental thinking itself. It must somehow combine radical openness to new possibilities with the capacity to make strong evaluations and commitments. The experimental philosopher cannot remain forever suspended in doubt, but must eventually choose which experiments to pursue and which values to create. This tension between intellectual honesty and practical necessity drives the experimental spirit toward its ultimate challenge. Can experimental thinking generate new values, or does it only destroy old ones? This question reveals the deepest challenge facing free spirits. Nietzsche's developing insight suggests that genuine philosophers must be both critics and creators. They must clear away inherited prejudices and simultaneously create new possibilities for human flourishing. As he envisions them, the philosopher, as we free spirits understand him as the man of the most comprehensive responsibility, who has the conscience for the overall development of mankind. Experimental thinking, properly understood, serves not destruction, but cultural and spiritual renewal. It points toward a new understanding of philosophical responsibility, not merely thinking clearly about existing problems, but creating the intellectual and spiritual conditions for human greatness. The experimental spirit thus becomes the foundation for Nietzsche's vision of philosophical creativity and cultural transformation. Nietzsche draws a distinction that cuts to the heart of human existence itself, the difference between noble and base types of human beings. This distinction has nothing to do with birth, wealth, or social position. A poor artist struggling in a garret might possess true nobility, whilst a wealthy merchant surrounded by luxury might represent the basest form of human existence. The difference lies in their relationship to values and power. There is master morality and slave morality, Nietzsche declares, and this division reveals two fundamentally different ways of being human. Noble individuals create values from strength and self-affirmation. They act from abundance, from a fullness of life that naturally overflows into creative expression. Their values emerge from their own nature, from what they are and what they can become. They say yes to existence, to their own power, to the responsibility of creating meaning in a world without predetermined purpose. Base individuals, by contrast, accept inherited values from weakness and resentment. They define themselves not by what they affirm, but by what they oppose. Their morality is reactive, born from scarcity rather than abundance, from the need to diminish others rather than to elevate themselves. They cannot create values because they lack the psychological strength to bear the weight of such creation. Instead, they cling to systems that promise to level all distinction, to reduce the exceptional to the mediocre. This psychological analysis reveals why Nietzsche views democratic movements with such alarm. The democratic ideal of equality, however well-intentioned, tends to eliminate the conditions necessary for cultural greatness and spiritual aristocracy. When all individuals are reduced to the same level, when exceptionality itself becomes suspect, the very possibility of human elevation disappears. The democratic movement is not only a form of the decay of political organization, but a form of the decay, namely the diminution, of man, making him mediocre and lowering his value. Democratic culture systematically discourages the kind of inequality that genuine culture requires. It makes exceptional achievement appear illegitimate, dangerous to social harmony. But genuine culture has always depended on exceptional individuals who could create new values and possibilities, who could push beyond the boundaries of what their age considered acceptable or even conceivable. This raises the most dangerous question in Nietzsche's philosophy. If genuine culture requires inequality and exceptional individuals, how can this be reconciled with justice and human dignity? The tension cuts deep. Nietzsche's commitment to human greatness seems to conflict with modern moral sensibilities about equality and fairness. Every elevation of the type man has hitherto been the work of an aristocratic society, and so it will always be. Does the cultivation of human excellence necessarily require the sacrifice of the many for the few? Must spiritual aristocracy depend on social or political oppression? These questions go to the heart of Nietzsche's entire philosophical project. They force us to confront whether human greatness is compatible with human compassion, whether the pursuit of excellence must inevitably create victims. Yet Nietzsche's developing insight points toward a resolution. Genuine nobility must be spiritual rather than social or political. It must be based on self-creation and value creation rather than inherited privilege or external power. What is noble? What does the word noble still mean for us nowadays? The question itself suggests that nobility can be redefined, transformed from a matter of birth or circumstance into a matter of psychological and cultural achievement. If nobility is the capacity for self-creation and value creation, then it becomes a possibility for anyone with the psychological strength to bear this responsibility. The question of inequality transforms from a social problem into a spiritual challenge. The issue becomes not how to eliminate differences between humans, but how to cultivate the conditions under which exceptional individuals can emerge and flourish. This is the path toward becoming who you are. Part 6. The Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche's genealogical analysis in On the Genealogy of Morals reveals one of philosophy's most radical insights. Our moral categories aren't eternal truths, but historical creations expressing fundamentally different forms of life. The distinction between master and slave morality exposes the hidden psychology behind our most cherished values, showing how what we call good and evil emerged from entirely different sources of human evaluation. Master morality springs from strength and self-affirmation. The ancient aristocrats who created these values judged from their own excellence, calling good everything that resembled themselves noble, powerful, beautiful, successful. Their bad was simply the opposite: common, weak, ugly, unsuccessful. These weren't moral condemnations but aristocratic descriptions, value judgments flowing naturally from their sense of superiority. The master says, "I am good, therefore you are bad," a spontaneous evaluation based on the overflowing confidence of strength. Slave morality emerges from an entirely different psychological source: resentment against the powerful. Here, good means humble, suffering, selfless, patient, the qualities of those who lack power. But crucially, slave morality creates evil as its primary category, designating the powerful as morally corrupt rather than simply different. The slave says, "You are evil, therefore I am good," a reactive evaluation that defines itself through opposition to strength. This represents more than different preferences. It reveals two fundamentally different ways of being human. Master morality celebrates life's ascending movement, strength, beauty, excellence, the creative power that shapes reality according to its will. Slave morality emerges from life's descending movement, weakness, seeking to drag down strength, suffering, demanding that power justify itself, resentment, creating values that make weakness appear morally superior to strength. The historical transformation Nietzsche traces shows how slave morality achieved one of the most successful revolutions in human history. The priestly class, led by Judaism and perfected by Christianity, didn't defeat the aristocrats through physical force, but through psychological cunning. They convinced the powerful that their strength was sinful, and the weak that their weakness was virtuous, creating entirely new forms of authority based on moral rather than physical dominance. It was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation and to hang on to this inversion with their teeth, Nietzsche observes. This wasn't mere rebellion but creative genius, the invention of a new form of human consciousness that made suffering meaningful and strength guilty. Christianity completed this revolution, spreading the slave revolt throughout the Roman world and eventually across Western civilization. The psychological mechanism proves devastatingly effective. Slave morality doesn't simply reject master values but systematically inverts them, transforming aristocratic virtues into sins and aristocratic vices into virtues. Pride becomes the deadliest sin. Humility becomes the highest virtue. Self-assertion becomes selfishness. Self-denial becomes moral excellence. The strong learn to doubt their strength. The weak learn to celebrate their weakness. This inversion solved the fundamental problem of human suffering by reinterpreting it as morally valuable rather than eliminating it. Christianity gave meaning to pain, dignity to weakness, hope to the hopeless, but at the cost of poisoning strength with guilt and excellence with suspicion. The slave revolt created a form of psychological revenge that proved more devastating than any physical conquest. The cultural consequences extend far beyond religion into the foundations of modern civilization. Democratic ideals, socialist movements, humanitarian ethics all emerge from the slave morality's basic conviction that equality and compassion represent moral progress over excellence and strength. We live within the psychological framework created by this ancient revolt, barely recognizing how thoroughly it has shaped our deepest assumptions about human value. Yet Nietzsche's Genealogy reveals the contingency of these seemingly natural moral categories. If our values emerged from specific historical conditions and psychological needs, they can be overcome by different conditions and different forms of life. The question becomes, what lies beyond the slave revolt in morality? Nietzsche developed genealogy as a revolutionary analytical approach that fundamentally transforms how we understand our most cherished values and concepts. Rather than treating morality, truth, or justice as eternal essences awaiting philosophical analysis, genealogical investigation traces their historical origins and transformations. This method reveals that what appears natural and necessary is actually contingent and constructed the product of specific human needs, power struggles, and psychological types operating under particular historical conditions. Traditional philosophy approaches moral concepts as timeless truths to be discovered through reason. Genealogy, by contrast, treats them as historical phenomena to be explained through careful investigation of their origins and development. As Nietzsche insists, we need a critique of moral values. The value of these values themselves must first be called in question, and for that, there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and circumstances in which they grew. This represents a form of philosophical archaeology that uncovers the buried foundations of contemporary consciousness, revealing how our deepest assumptions about good and evil, truth and falsehood, emerged from very specific historical circumstances. The genealogical method distinguishes itself from traditional history through its focus on the power struggles and psychological needs that created our moral categories, rather than simply chronicling events or ideas. Genealogical analysis looks for the interests served by different values and the psychological types that created them. Nietzsche emphasizes this crucial methodological principle. The cause of the origin of a thing and its eventual utility, its actual employment and place in a system of purposes lie worlds apart. A concept's current meaning and function may bear little resemblance to the forces that originally brought it into existence. This approach treats values as symptoms to be diagnosed rather than truths to be discovered or defended. Genealogy doesn't ask whether values are true or false, but what they do, what forms of life they promote or inhibit, what psychological types they serve or undermine. When we examine concepts like compassion, humility, or self-sacrifice genealogically, we discover the specific human interests these values served and the particular forms of power they exercised or resisted. The shocking discovery that genealogical analysis reveals is that our highest values often have lowest origins in practical necessity, psychological weakness, or will to power disguised as moral idealism. This isn't cynical reductionism, but scientific honesty about the human-made character of all values. As Nietzsche declares, there are altogether no moral facts. What we take to be objective, moral truths, are human creations serving particular psychological and social functions. Consider how altruism emerges from the weak's need for protection, transforming their vulnerability into a moral virtue that obligates the strong to care for them. Justice develops from the strong's need for predictable rules that preserve their advantages, whilst appearing fair to all. Truth-seeking serves the will to power through intellectual domination, allowing scholars and priests to claim authority over others through their supposed access to higher knowledge. These discoveries are simultaneously deflating our highest ideals, have mundane origins, and liberating. If humans created current values, they can create different ones. The liberating effect of genealogical analysis becomes clear once we see how values were created by humans under specific historical conditions. We can then imagine creating different values, more appropriate to our current needs and possibilities. Genealogy serves Nietzsche's broader project of cultural renewal by clearing away inherited prejudices and opening space for new forms of value creation. This represents his ultimate goal: a revaluation of all values. This question mark, so black, so huge, that it casts shadows upon the man who puts it down. Genealogy is not merely destructive but serves the constructive goal of making authentic human self-creation possible. By revealing the contingent origins of our moral categories, genealogical analysis provides the foundation for moving beyond inherited values toward new forms of life affirmation and value creation. Once we understand how previous generations created the values we inherited, we can take responsibility for creating values worthy of our own highest possibilities. The ascetic ideal stands as perhaps the most powerful and enduring value system in Western civilization. Yet its very success reveals something troubling about human nature itself. Nietzsche's analysis cuts to the heart of how this ideal has systematically devalued everything immediate and tangible: life, body, sensuality, the material world, in favor of otherworldly goals and spiritual purification. What appears across cultures and centuries is remarkably consistent: the elevation of denial over affirmation, transcendence over immanence, the eternal over the temporal. This ideal manifests in seemingly different forms, yet shares a common core. Religious monasticism withdraws from worldly engagement in pursuit of divine union. Philosophical otherworldliness, from Plato onwards, treats the material world as mere shadow of higher reality. Scientific objectivity demands the elimination of personal perspective and bodily involvement. Artistic aestheticism seeks pure beauty, divorced from practical concerns. Each represents what Nietzsche identifies as the same fundamental impulse: the systematic negation of immediate existence in favor of something beyond it. What does the ascetic ideal mean? Nietzsche asks. In the case of an artist, we have seen nothing at all. In the case of a philosopher, something like a sense and instinct for the most favorable preconditions of higher spirituality. The ideal adapts to different contexts, whilst maintaining its essential character, the conviction that life as immediate experienced is insufficient, corrupt, or illusory, requiring transcendence through denial. The historical scope is staggering. From Plato's divided line distinguishing the world of forms from material appearance, through Christian otherworldliness that treats earthly existence as veil of tears, to modern scientific methodology that demands the elimination of subjective perspective, Western civilization has been shaped by variations on this theme of life denial, masquerading as life enhancement. Yet, the ascetic ideal's success poses a psychological puzzle. Why would living beings systematically choose values that negate life itself? Nietzsche's answer reveals the ideal's psychological genius. It succeeded by providing meaning for suffering rather than eliminating suffering itself. Human beings can endure almost any pain provided they understand why they suffer. The ascetic ideal offered not relief from suffering but interpretation of suffering as spiritually valuable as punishment for sin requiring repentance, as test of faith demanding endurance, as purification process leading to salvation. Man, the bravest of animals and the one most accustomed to suffering, does not repudiate suffering as such. He desires it. He even seeks it out, provided he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. This represents a brilliant solution to the threat of meaninglessness. Rather than risk the conclusion that suffering serves no purpose, that existence might be fundamentally absurd, the ascetic ideal reframes suffering as the very mechanism of spiritual advancement. Pain becomes proof of progress. Denial becomes affirmation of higher truth. Weakness becomes strength through acknowledgement of dependence on divine grace. The mechanism is psychologically sophisticated. The ideal doesn't promise to eliminate suffering, but transforms sufferers into willing participants in their own negation. The monk embraces poverty, chastity, and obedience, not as external impositions, but as chosen paths to spiritual freedom. The philosopher renounces sensual pleasure not as sacrifice, but as liberation from illusion. The scientist suppresses personal involvement not as loss, but as gain in objectivity. Each transforms what might appear as diminishment into enhancement through reinterpretation. Central to this transformation is the figure of the ascetic priest, who functions as both psychologist and physician. The priest's genius lies not in eliminating the causes of suffering, but in changing how suffering is experienced and understood. The ascetic priest must be accepted by us as the predestined savior, shepherd, and advocate of the sick herd. The priest provides therapeutic techniques that offer genuine psychological relief whilst perpetuating the very conditions that make such relief necessary. Confession allows the verbalization of guilt, providing temporary relief through acknowledgement, whilst reinforcing the framework that generates guilt. Part 7. The Twilight of False Idols. Nietzsche's account in Twilight of the Idols reveals one of philosophy's most devastating ironies. Western metaphysics destroyed itself through its own relentless pursuit of truth. His famous schema traces how the true world, that realm of ultimate reality, philosophers claimed, lay behind appearances, gradually became so remote and questionable that it finally abolished itself entirely. The process began with Plato's realm of forms. Here was the true world accessible to the wise, the philosopher who could ascend through dialectical reasoning to grasp eternal essences beyond the shadows of sensible experience. Already, however, the true world was positioned as difficult to reach, requiring exceptional intellectual virtue and philosophical training. Christianity inherited this structure. but made it even more remote. The true world became heaven, promised to the virtuous, but accessible only after death through divine grace. No longer could philosophical reasoning guarantee access. Now one needed faith, moral purity, and divine favor. The true world had retreated further from immediate human reach. Kant delivered what seemed the final blow whilst attempting to preserve metaphysics. His things in themselves represented the true world as completely unknowable. We could think it, even postulate its necessity, but never know it. The true world had become a pure idea, forever beyond the reach of human cognition, yet somehow still required to make sense of experience. But Kant's solution contained its own destruction. If the true world is unknowable and unreachable, why posit it at all? Nietzsche saw the logical conclusion. The true world is an idea which is no longer good for anything, not even obligating, so let us abolish it. The very reasoning that created the true world had made it so problematic that it eliminated itself. This represents the self-destruction of metaphysical thinking through its own internal logic rather than external criticism. Each stage of Western philosophy made the true world more remote and questionable until the final recognition dawned. The concept had become completely empty and dispensable. Yet Nietzsche's insight goes deeper. The true world we have abolished. What world has remained? The apparent one, perhaps? But no. With the true world, we have also abolished the apparent one. Once we stop positing a true world behind appearances, we no longer need to treat the apparent world as merely apparent. The fundamental dualism that has structured Western thought since Plato simply collapses. What remains is simply the world, neither true nor apparent, but the only world there is. This represents a complete transformation of philosophical thinking, from the search for reality behind appearances to the affirmation of appearances as reality. No longer do we need to justify this world by appeal to another world. No longer do we need to treat our experience as merely subjective appearance of objective reality. Nietzsche marks this moment with Incipit Zarathustra. Zarathustra begins. The philosophical clearing away creates the space for his constructive philosophy. The collapse of metaphysical foundations is simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because we lose absolute reference points. Liberating because we gain freedom from otherworldly obligations. But this creates a profound crisis. How do we orient ourselves in a world without absolute reference points or metaphysical foundations? As Nietzsche recognized, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. If Western civilization has been built on metaphysical foundations that have now collapsed, what prevents the complete dissolution of meaning and value? This crisis of foundations makes Nietzsche's project of revaluation both necessary and urgent. New foundations must be created, or European culture will collapse into nihilism. The twilight of false idols demands the dawn of new values. Nietzsche's diagnosis of metaphysical thinking reveals 4 fundamental errors that sustain traditional philosophy for millennia. These errors, confusing cause and effect, inventing false causality, creating imaginary causes, and the fiction of free will, expose something crucial about human nature itself. Rather than representing mere intellectual mistakes, they reveal the psychological needs that drove humans to create metaphysical systems in the first place. The error of false causality, Nietzsche observes. People have believed at all times that they knew what a cause is. But whence did we take our knowledge, or more precisely, our faith, that we had such knowledge? This question cuts to the heart of traditional thinking's most basic assumption. that we can understand and control the forces shaping our existence. Each error serves the fundamental human need to feel in control of existence by creating the illusion that we understand reality's structure. When we confuse cause and effect, we impose our psychological experience of willing onto external events, making the world seem responsive to human intention. When we invent false causality, we create explanatory frameworks that make chaotic experience seem orderly and predictable. When we create imaginary causes, gods, souls, moral forces, we populate reality with entities that respond to human concerns and values. The fiction of free will makes us feel like genuine agents rather than complex products of forces beyond our control. These errors reveal something profound about the relationship between truth and life. Nietzsche recognizes that false beliefs often prove more useful than true ones, serving life-preserving functions even whilst distorting our understanding of reality. The falseness of a judgment is not for us necessarily an objection to a judgment. In this respect, our new language may sound strangest. The fiction of free will, for example, makes moral responsibility possible, even though it misrepresents the actual nature of human action. Personal identity creates stable selfhood, even though it ignores the constant flux of psychological experience. Causal understanding provides practical guidance, even though it oversimplifies complex interactions between countless forces. This recognition creates a fundamental challenge. If these errors serve life, why expose them as errors? The answer lies in understanding that simply exposing errors is not enough. We need new ways of thinking that serve life without requiring false consolations or metaphysical illusions. Traditional beliefs, moral responsibility, personal identity, causal understanding depend on errors that serve important psychological and social functions. The question becomes, how do we maintain these life-serving functions whilst abandoning their false metaphysical foundations? Nietzsche's insight points toward a revolutionary possibility. What does not kill me makes me stronger. The exposure of traditional errors serves not destruction, but transformation. If humans created their current forms of understanding unconsciously through historical processes driven by psychological needs, they might create new forms consciously through philosophical and artistic creativity. The anatomy of error reveals that humans are fundamentally creative beings who construct their understanding of reality rather than simply discovering eternal truths. This realization opens up possibilities for conscious value creation and self-creation that weren't available when humans believed they were discovering pre-given truths. We, however, want to become those we are human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. The exposure of traditional errors serves the goal of authentic human self-creation by revealing the creative power that was always operating beneath the surface of apparently discovered truths. Nietzsche's diagnosis of European spiritual sickness begins with his penetrating analysis of German culture, which he sees as symptomatic of a broader civilizational malaise. The Germans, he observes, once earned the title the people of thinkers, but do they still think at all today? This question cuts to the heart of his cultural critique. What Nietzsche identifies is not merely intellectual decline, but the loss of cultural unity itself, the fragmentation of life into separate spheres that were once integrated in genuine cultural wholes. Modern culture suffers from a devastating separation. Art, science, politics, and religion operate as isolated domains, each developing according to its own logic whilst losing connection to the others. This fragmentation produces concrete symptoms that Nietzsche diagnoses with surgical precision. the replacement of cultural creativity with scholarly specialization, the substitution of national pride for genuine cultural achievement, and the rise of mass culture that systematically appeals to the lowest common denominator rather than cultivating excellence. The result is a civilization that produces useful experts but has lost the capacity to generate great individuals or great works. The problem of specialization reveals itself as particularly corrosive. Modern educational institutions serve economic and political needs rather than cultural ones, creating a fundamental mismatch between what society rewards and what culture requires for genuine flourishing. Universities train students to contribute to existing knowledge rather than questioning fundamental assumptions or creating genuinely new perspectives. This systematic cultivation of mediocrity makes the emergence of exceptional individuals increasingly difficult. One thing is needful, Nietzsche recognizes: to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. Yet, modern education actively discourages such self-creation in favor of conformity to established patterns. The contrast between genuine culture and modern civilization becomes stark under Nietzsche's analysis. Genuine culture produces great individuals and works. Modern civilization produces efficient systems and comfortable mediocrity. Authentic culture requires inequality, risk, and the cultivation of exceptional individuals, whilst modern civilization prioritizes equality, security, and the satisfaction of average needs. The essential thing in heaven and earth, Nietzsche understands, is that there should be long obedience in the same direction. Thereby results, and has always resulted in the long run, something which has made life worth living. Modern democratic culture systematically eliminates the conditions that create greatness by making all forms of hierarchy and distinction appear illegitimate. The very notion of cultural excellence becomes suspect when measured against egalitarian ideals. This creates what Nietzsche sees as a profound spiritual crisis. A civilization that has lost the ability to distinguish between higher and lower, between what elevates human existence and what merely makes it more comfortable. This diagnosis points toward the need for cultural physicians who can not only identify sickness, but point towards spiritual health. Nietzsche envisions philosophers as doctors of culture, individuals capable of understanding both the symptoms of cultural decadence and the conditions that would enable cultural renewal. "I am not a man, I am dynamite," he declares, recognizing his own role in this cultural transformation. Such cultural physicians must understand that renewal cannot be achieved through external reforms or institutional changes. It requires the emergence of individuals capable of creating new values and possibilities from their own creative power. The diagnosis of cultural decadence thus serves Nietzsche's broader project, preparing the ground for a new form of human existence that could create authentic culture in the modern world, one that honors excellence whilst remaining vital and creative, rather than merely preserving dead traditions. Part 8. The Antichrist and the Revaluation of Values. Nietzsche's most radical critique emerges in The Antichrist, where Christianity reveals itself not as humanity's salvation, but as the systematization of life-denying values that make humans spiritually sick and psychologically weak. This represents far more than theological disagreement. It constitutes a devastating diagnosis of Western civilization's foundational illness. Christianity, Nietzsche argues, systematically inverts natural aristocratic instincts, transforming strength into weakness and making suffering appear noble rather than something to overcome. The psychological machinery of this inversion operates through concepts that appear redemptive but function as instruments of spiritual destruction. Sin, guilt, redemption, and salvation create the very psychological conditions they claim to cure, trapping humans in cycles of self-hatred and otherworldly hope. These concepts systematically undermine human confidence, creativity, and life affirmation by making natural instincts appear sinful and requiring constant self-surveillance and self-denial. As Nietzsche observes, the concept of guilt and punishment, the whole moral world order, was set up against science, against the deliverance of man from priests. Christianity creates artificial problems and then offers itself as the solution, making humans dependent on priestly mediation rather than developing their own creative powers. This psychological dependency represents one of history's most successful manipulations, the complete transformation of how humans evaluate themselves and others. The Christian transvaluation of values achieved something unprecedented. It made weakness appear strong and suffering appear noble, inverting natural aristocratic instincts and creating a systematic reversal of healthy human values. This transformation shaped Western civilization's understanding of morality, politics, and human nature, creating institutions and practices that systematically discourage excellence and promote mediocrity. Christianity, in Nietzsche's analysis, has sided with all that is weak and base. With all failures, it has made an ideal of whatever contradicts the instinct of the strong life to preserve itself. The consequences extend far beyond individual psychology into the very fabric of European culture. The collapse of Christian faith creates a fundamental crisis for Western civilization. As Nietzsche recognizes, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. If Christian values provided the foundation for Western moral and political institutions for 2 millennia, their collapse threatens to leave European culture without organizing principles. This makes Nietzsche's project of revaluation both necessary and urgent. New values must be created or Western civilization will collapse into nihilism and decadence. Yet this critique serves a constructive purpose, clearing away psychological obstacles to genuine human flourishing. By exposing Christianity's life-denying character, Nietzsche creates space for the emergence of life-affirming values that celebrate human creativity, strength, and self-determination rather than demanding their sacrifice to otherworldly ideals. Christianity presents us with one of history's most extraordinary paradoxes. A religion founded in the name of someone whose actual way of life contradicted everything the religion would come to represent. Nietzsche's psychological analysis reveals that Jesus, as a historical figure, embodied precisely the kind of life affirmation that institutional Christianity systematically denies. In reality, Nietzsche observed, there has been only one Christian, and he died on the cross. This isn't mere provocation. Nietzsche's careful reading of the Gospels reveals Jesus as a psychological type who lived without the very categories that would define Christianity: guilt, sin, judgment, and the need for redemption. The historical Jesus represented immediate unity with life itself. He loved without conditions, forgave without moral accounting, and eliminated the distance between divine and human that would become Christianity's central preoccupation. Jesus lived in what Nietzsche calls the eternal present, a state of being where the kingdom of heaven isn't a future promise, but a present condition of the heart. This psychological portrait shows someone who had transcended resentment entirely. Jesus didn't oppose his enemies through moral condemnation, but through a way of being that made such opposition meaningless. He embodied the very life affirmation that Christianity would later systematically suppress through its doctrines of original sin and otherworldly salvation. The transformation began immediately after the crucifixion. Paul and the early church couldn't understand or embody Jesus' actual teaching, so they created something entirely different, a metaphysical doctrine that made Jesus' death the center of a cosmic drama of sin and salvation. Paul's genius lay in constructing a systematic theology that turned Jesus' way of life into a belief system about Jesus' divine nature and sacrificial death. The glad tidings, Nietzsche noted, were followed closely by the absolutely worst tidings, those of Paul. Where Jesus had lived immediate divine experience, Paul created future promises dependent on correct belief. Where Jesus had eliminated guilt through love, Paul systematized guilt as the foundation of human nature. Where Jesus had embodied unity between human and divine, Paul created an unbridgeable gap requiring priestly mediation. This historical corruption reveals Christianity's fundamental impossibility as a moral system. It demands self-sacrifice, while secretly fostering the very resentment it claims to cure. Christian morality creates a psychological mechanism that produces the problems it promises to solve. Natural human instincts appear sinful, requiring constant self-denial, which generates guilt about basic desires, which demands relief through further self-sacrifice. Christianity has taken the side of everything weak, base, ill-constituted. Nietzsche argued, it has made an ideal out of opposition to the preservative instincts of strong life. This isn't accidental, but systematic. Christian ethics requires believers to hate their natural desires, then offers salvation from the guilt this hatred produces. The cycle ensures psychological dependence whilst preventing the genuine health and creative self-development that Jesus himself embodied. This analysis suggests that the fundamental problem lies not with Jesus, but with the priestly interpretation that created Christianity as we know it. Jesus' insight that the kingdom of heaven is a condition of the heart, not something that comes upon the earth or after death, points toward a form of spiritual health that transcends traditional moral categories entirely. If Jesus represented life affirmation rather than life denial, then moving beyond Christianity might actually mean recovering something closer to his original insight. This serves Nietzsche's broader project perfectly. Genuine revaluation requires recognizing that the guilt and redemption system Christianity created prevents the very spiritual flourishing that its founder embodied. Nietzsche's recognition strikes at the heart of modernity's deepest challenge. Simply rejecting Christian values accomplishes nothing unless new values emerge from entirely different sources and according to fundamentally different criteria. The death of God creates a vacuum that cannot remain empty. Either humanity fills it through deliberate revaluation, or nihilism fills it through cultural collapse. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries, Nietzsche declares, with characteristic boldness. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. This history can be related even now, for necessity itself is at work here. Revaluation represents humanity's response to this necessity, involving not merely criticism but construction, not simply the destruction of old values, but the creation of new ones appropriate to post-Christian existence. The systematic scope of this project extends far beyond moral reform. Revaluation must address the entire framework of concepts and assumptions that structure human experience. Truth, knowledge, beauty, justice, meaning itself. Every inherited category requires examination through fresh eyes, evaluated not by its conformity to traditional standards, but by its effects on human flourishing. This comprehensive approach distinguishes Nietzsche's project from mere moral philosophy. He envisions nothing less than the reconstruction of the conceptual foundations of Western culture. The criterion for these new values emerges from Nietzsche's insight that they must enhance life, promote growth, and increase power and creativity, rather than diminishing human potential through life denial or otherworldly escape. This provides a naturalistic foundation for evaluation that requires no metaphysical or religious assumptions. What is good? He asks with revolutionary directness. All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. This principle shifts the entire basis of moral thinking from obedience to transcendent commands to the cultivation of human excellence and creative potential. The revolutionary implication transforms how we understand value itself. Values are no longer discovered through rational analysis or received through divine revelation, but created through human creative power. This places enormous responsibility on those capable of such creation. They must generate values that can inspire and guide human existence without cosmic authorization or metaphysical foundation. The philosopher, as Nietzsche understands this role, becomes the man of the most comprehensive responsibility, who has the conscience for the overall development of mankind. Such responsibility cannot be borne by everyone. Revaluation requires exceptional individuals who combine intellectual honesty about the groundlessness of all values with the creative strength necessary to generate new possibilities. These individuals must possess psychological requirements that seem almost contradictory, complete skepticism about inherited truths, alongside unwavering commitment to their own creative vision. They must be strong enough to create meaning, whilst acknowledging that their creation has no foundation beyond their own will to create. This challenge reveals why revaluation cannot be accomplished through collective action or institutional reform. It requires individuals capable of standing alone, creating new possibilities through their own creative power, then inspiring others to embrace these possibilities, not through rational argument, but through the compelling force of their example. The revaluation of values demands nothing less than a transformation in the type of human being capable of cultural leadership. The promise of revaluation lies in its potential to create a culture that affirms life without requiring metaphysical consolation. But only if humanity can produce individuals capable of this transformation. Nietzsche envisions a form of human existence that creates meaning through creative power, rather than discovering it through analysis or receiving it through revelation. I know my fate, he anticipates with characteristic intensity. One day, my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth. This crisis represents both the greatest opportunity and the greatest danger facing modern humanity. The opportunity: authentic human culture based on life affirmation rather than life denial. Part 9. Thus spoke Zarathustra, the teaching. Zarathustra's most famous teaching concerns the three metamorphoses of the human spirit, a systematic progression through which individuals must pass to achieve authentic existence. This parable reveals the spiritual development necessary for genuine human flourishing, mapping the complete journey from conformity through rebellion to creative innocence. Three metamorphoses of the spirit do I designate to you. Zarathustra announces how the spirit becometh a camel, the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. The camel represents the spirit that says, "Thou shalt," to inherited commands, bearing traditional values and moral burdens with reverence and strength. This load-bearing spirit asks, "What is the heaviest thing, ye heroes, that I may take it upon me and rejoice in my strength?" The camel stage involves developing spiritual discipline and the capacity to carry heavy responsibilities, learning moral seriousness through obedience to external authority. Most individuals remain at this level throughout their lives, finding security in traditional structures and inherited wisdom. Yet, the camel stage, whilst necessary for developing strength, ultimately represents a form of spiritual slavery. The camel bears burdens imposed by others, accepting values created by previous generations, without questioning their validity or relevance. This acceptance prevents individuals from discovering their own authentic relationship to existence, keeping them dependent on external sources of meaning and direction. The lion emerges when the spirit can no longer bear inherited constraints, transforming burden-bearing into active rebellion. The lion says, "I will," to traditional authority, using its power to destroy old values and create freedom through negation. To create itself freedom and give a holy nay even unto duty. For that, my brethren, there is need of the lion. The lion's strength lies precisely in its capacity for destruction, clearing away inherited moral systems that have become obstacles to authentic existence. However, the lion's function remains purely negative. It can destroy old values, but cannot create new ones, leaving individuals in a spiritual desert without positive direction. The lion liberates through destruction, but offers no constructive alternative, creating freedom without providing guidance for how to use that freedom creatively. The child represents the ultimate goal of spiritual development, the capacity to create values through innocent play, forgetting the past, and beginning anew without inherited guilt or resentment. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, a holy yea saying. The child creates from joy and abundance rather than reaction and resentment, establishing values through affirmation rather than negation. This childlike innocence eliminates moral categories like guilt and sin that prevent genuine affirmation of existence. The child creates values naturally, without the burden of justifying them against inherited standards or proving their worth through comparison with traditional systems. This represents authentic value creation, the establishment of meaning through creative play, rather than moral obligation. The three metamorphoses reveal the complete spiritual journey necessary for becoming who one truly is, progressing from acceptance through destruction to innocent creation, pointing toward Nietzsche's vision of human beings who have transcended traditional moral categories entirely. The Übermensch stands as Nietzsche's most provocative and misunderstood concept. Not a biological Superman, but a human being who has achieved something far more radical, complete spiritual transformation through self-creation. When Zarathustra proclaims, "I teach you the overman, man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him?" He announces not physical evolution, but the possibility of transcending traditional humanity itself. The Übermensch represents the individual who has moved beyond the fundamental dependency that defines ordinary human existence, the need for external sources of meaning, value, and identity. This transformation involves a profound psychological shift. Where traditional humans seek validation through conformity to inherited standards, religious commandments, or social conventions, the Übermensch creates meaning through pure self-affirmation. This isn't rebellion against existing values, but something far more complete, the development of individuals who can live authentically without any metaphysical support or cosmic authorization. They have internalized the death of God not as loss, but as liberation, the opening of infinite creative possibility. The Übermensch embodies the culmination of Nietzsche's three metamorphoses of the spirit. Having passed through the burden-bearing camel and the destructive lion, they achieve the innocence of the child who creates values naturally, without the weight of tradition or the violence of rebellion. They represent humanity that has learned to say yes to existence on purely human terms. This transformation manifests most clearly in the aesthetic approach to existence. The Übermensch treats life as a work of art to be created rather than a moral test to be passed or a rational problem to be solved. Nietzsche's imperative, "Become who you are," finds its fullest expression here, not discovering some predetermined essence, but actively creating oneself through conscious choice and deliberate action. As he writes, "One thing is needful: to give style to one's character, a great and rare art." This aesthetic criterion revolutionizes human possibility. The Übermensch doesn't simply live differently, but creates new possibilities for human existence that others might follow. They demonstrate that human freedom reaches its ultimate expression in self-creation, the ability to shape oneself consciously and deliberately, rather than being shaped by external forces. This represents the artist of existence who has learned to impose form upon the chaos of experience through pure creative will. The relationship between the Übermensch and eternal recurrence reveals the selective nature of this transformation. Only those capable of unconditional life affirmation can achieve this spiritual metamorphosis. The Übermensch passes the ultimate test of eternal recurrence by loving existence enough to will its infinite repetition, demonstrating complete affirmation without need for external justification. When faced with the prospect of living the same life eternally, they respond with Nietzsche's formula: "Was that life is less than #0, 5 is greater than well then." Once more, this requires the elimination of resentment, guilt, and otherworldly hope, all the psychological mechanisms that prevent unconditional acceptance of existence. The Übermensch has achieved amor fati, the love of fate that embraces everything that has been and will be. This creates a natural selection of consciousness. Only those who develop the psychological resources for complete life affirmation can undergo the transformation. Yet the Übermensch serves not merely as individual achievement, but as cultural possibility. Nietzsche envisions what humans might become if they develop the courage to create their own values and meaning after the collapse of traditional foundations. The goal of humanity cannot lie in its end, but only in its highest specimens, he declares, positioning the Übermensch as both inspiration and guide for human development beyond nihilism. This vision provides the constructive alternative to cultural decay. If traditional sources of meaning have collapsed, humans must create meaning through their own creative power. The Übermensch represents the successful completion of this task, proof that human beings can flourish without metaphysical support, creating value through the sheer force of affirmation. They cannot be programmed or systematically produced, but must emerge from individuals who develop the spiritual resources necessary for authentic self-creation. In becoming who they are, they show humanity what it might become. Nietzsche's most revolutionary insight emerges from a simple but devastating observation. Beneath every human action, every cultural creation, every moral system lies a fundamental drive that has nothing to do with survival, pleasure, or rational calculation. Life itself, he declares, is will to power, not the will to live. That would be too passive, too reactive, but the will to expand, to grow, to exercise influence and creative capability. Life itself is will to power, he writes. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect, and most frequent results thereof. This principle operates at every level of existence. In biological processes, organisms don't merely seek to maintain themselves, but to grow, to dominate their environment, to expand their influence. In psychological development, humans seek not comfort but challenge, not security but the expansion of their capabilities. In cultural creation, societies generate art, philosophy, and institutions, not from necessity, but from the overflow of creative power seeking expression. Will to power provides a unified principle for understanding why living beings act as they do, not from lack or need, but from abundance seeking outlet. The crucial distinction emerges between healthy and decadent expressions of this fundamental drive. Healthy will to power manifests as creativity, self-mastery, cultural achievement, and the expansion of human possibilities. The artist creating new forms of beauty, the philosopher generating new concepts, the individual overcoming their limitations. These represent will to power in its life-enhancing form. What is good? Nietzsche asks. All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. Decadent expressions include resentment, revenge, the domination of the weak, and the creation of systems that diminish human potential. The priest who manipulates through guilt, the moralist who diminishes life through prohibition, the individual who seeks power through making others smaller, these represent will to power turned against life itself. The same fundamental drive produces both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human degradation, depending on whether it enhances or diminishes the conditions for further growth and creation. This insight transforms how values themselves must be evaluated. Rather than judging beliefs, moral systems, or cultural practices by their conformity to abstract rational or religious standards, Nietzsche proposes a naturalistic criterion. Do they enhance or diminish life's power and creativity? The question is not whether a belief is true, he argues, but whether it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps species-cultivating. This shifts evaluation from questions of correctness to questions of what different values make possible for human development and cultural creation. The philosophical implications prove staggering. If will to power is the fundamental principle of existence, then reality consists not of substances, atoms, or fixed entities, but of competing wills to power in constant dynamic interaction is less than #0. 5 is greater than. The world becomes fundamentally creative rather than mechanical, a realm of eternal becoming rather than stable being. This world, Nietzsche declares, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end. This metaphysical insight connects directly to his other revolutionary concepts. Will to power explains why eternal recurrence is possible. Reality consists of cyclical energy rather than linear progression. It explains why the Übermensch becomes necessary. Someone must consciously direct will to power toward life enhancement rather than allowing it to manifest in decadent forms. It explains why revaluation becomes urgent. Current moral and cultural systems often express decadent rather than healthy will to power, channeling human energy into life-diminishing rather than life-enhancing directions. Will to power thus provides the foundation for understanding existence as creative self-transformation rather than conformity to external standards. The question becomes not what we should do according to predetermined rules, but what we can become through the conscious cultivation and direction of our fundamental life energy toward the expansion of human possibilities. Part 10. The Higher Men and Cultural Transformation. The higher men stand as perhaps the most poignant figures in Nietzsche's philosophical drama, those who have achieved the intellectual courage to recognize the death of God and the collapse of traditional values, yet remain tragically suspended between the old world they have transcended and the new world they cannot create. These are not the masses who continue living within inherited illusions, nor are they the Übermensch who will forge entirely new values through sheer creative will. They occupy that precarious middle ground of modern consciousness, seeing clearly but unable to act decisively, possessing the burden of insight without the compensation of creative power. Zarathustra recognizes their peculiar position when he declares, "Ye higher men, this God was your greatest danger. Only since he lay in the grave have ye again arisen." They have indeed arisen from the death of traditional foundations, but their resurrection remains incomplete. The higher men possess what Nietzsche calls the distinguishing mark of genuine superiority. They see and hear immeasurably more, and see and hear thoughtfully. This expanded consciousness becomes both their glory and their curse, for they cannot unknow what they have discovered about the groundlessness of inherited meaning. Consider Nietzsche's analysis of specific figures who embody this tragic condition. Schopenhauer achieved remarkable intellectual honesty about the reality of suffering and the illusory nature of conventional consolations, yet his very clarity led him into pessimistic life denial rather than life affirmation. He saw through the veil of Maya, but concluded that existence itself was a mistake to be escaped, rather than a challenge to be embraced. Wagner created powerful artistic visions that transcended bourgeois morality and conventional aesthetics, yet remained trapped within romantic nostalgia for a mythical past rather than facing forward toward genuine cultural creation. The free spirits whom Nietzsche celebrates throughout his middle works achieved critical independence from inherited authorities, yet often became merely destructive, excellent at demolishing old idols, but incapable of generating new sources of meaning and value. Each represents a partial solution to the crisis of meaning after the death of God, and each reveals why partial solutions ultimately fail. The higher men possess sufficient strength to break free from conventional humanity, but insufficient strength to achieve complete self-transformation. They become caught in their own superiority, often using their insight as a form of spiritual pride that prevents further development. Their very advancement beyond ordinary consciousness makes them vulnerable to distinctive forms of spiritual sickness, for they cannot find satisfaction in the conventional consolations that still sustain the masses. This creates the central danger facing higher men: the temptation to create new forms of the ascetic ideal rather than moving forward to genuine life affirmation. Unable to bear the weight of existence without transcendent justification, they often retreat into sophisticated forms of world denial, aesthetic withdrawal, philosophical pessimism, or romantic idealization of the past. Zarathustra warns against precisely this temptation. Ye higher men, ye think that I am here to put right what ye have put wrong, or that I want henceforth to make snugger beds for you sufferers. The danger lies not in their suffering itself, but in their desire to make that suffering comfortable rather than transformative. The tragedy of the higher men illuminates the extraordinary difficulty of the transition from traditional to self-created values. Their failures reveal that intellectual recognition of the death of God, whilst necessary, remains insufficient for authentic transformation. Something more is required, a fundamental reorientation of the will itself, a capacity for creative affirmation that goes beyond critical negation. Nietzsche's insight cuts deep. Man is a rope, tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. The higher men represent humanity stretched across that abyss, having left behind their animal innocence but not yet achieved superhuman creativity. Their situation mirrors that of European culture itself, caught between collapsed traditional foundations and not yet created new ones. Understanding their tragedy becomes essential for grasping both the necessity and the extraordinary difficulty of Nietzsche's project of cultural renewal through individual transformation. The Last Man represents Nietzsche's most chilling vision of humanity's future. Not the dramatic collapse into nihilistic despair, but something far more insidious, the complete elimination of human greatness through the pursuit of comfort and security, where nihilism destroys meaning through violent negation. The Last Man achieves the same result through gentle suffocation. He embodies the logical endpoint of democratic and utilitarian values, the human type that has successfully eliminated all sources of suffering by eliminating everything that makes life worth living. Zarathustra describes this creature with devastating precision. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? So asketh the last man and blinketh. These questions reveal the complete atrophy of human aspiration. The last man no longer experiences the great passions that drive cultural achievement. Neither great love nor great hatred, neither soaring ambition nor crushing despair. He has achieved a kind of spiritual anesthesia, trading the capacity for transcendence for the guarantee of contentment. This represents the ultimate victory of the reactive forces that Nietzsche traced through the genealogy of morals, the complete triumph of those who seek to diminish life rather than enhance it. The psychological portrait Nietzsche paints is terrifying precisely because it appears so reasonable. The last man has eliminated risk, uncertainty, and the burden of self-creation. He lives in a world perfectly calibrated to human weakness, where every need is satisfied and every discomfort eliminated. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and blink thereby. This blinking, this inability to sustain focused vision, captures their essential character. They cannot look steadily at anything because they have lost the capacity for genuine engagement with reality. Democratic culture, Nietzsche argues, systematically produces such creatures by eliminating the conditions that create greatness. The democratic principle of equality doesn't merely redistribute political power. It fundamentally reshapes human psychology by making all forms of distinction appear illegitimate. The democratic movement is not only a form of the decay of political organization, but a form of the decay, namely the diminution of man. This diminishment operates through the constant pressure toward conformity, the suspicion of excellence, and the elevation of average needs and desires as the measure of social policy. Democratic institutions create what we might call a tyranny of mediocrity, not through violent suppression, but through the gentle insistence that all perspectives are equally valid, all achievements equally valuable, and all ways of life equally worthy of respect. This apparent tolerance masks a deeper intolerance, the systematic discouragement of anything that rises above the common level. The result is a culture that makes exceptionality appear not merely difficult, but morally suspect. The appeal of this arrangement runs deeper than mere laziness or cowardice. Equality and mediocrity relieve individuals of the terrifying burden of self-creation that authentic existence demands. They offer an escape from the anxiety and responsibility that come with genuine freedom. The last man represents the ultimate solution to the existential problem. If you eliminate the conditions that make greatness possible, you also eliminate the painful awareness of your failure to achieve it. This seductive power makes the last man far more dangerous than the nihilist. The nihilist at least maintains the capacity for despair, which preserves the possibility of eventual renewal. The last man has eliminated even this possibility. He experiences neither the ecstasy of creation nor the agony of destruction. neither the joy of discovery nor the pain of loss. He has achieved perfect homeostasis, and in doing so, has ceased to be fully human. The cultural consequences extend far beyond individual psychology. Last man culture represents the systematic flattening of human possibilities, the end of the conditions that produce exceptional individuals and genuine cultural achievements. The earth hath then become small, and on it there hoppeth the last man, who maketh everything small. This shrinking isn't merely metaphorical. It describes the actual reduction of human aspiration to the management of comfort and the avoidance of risk. Modern democratic and technological culture tends inexorably toward this outcome unless consciously resisted. Eternal recurrence operates as both Nietzsche's most radical cosmological hypothesis and his most penetrating psychological test. The thought itself appears deceptively simple. What if all events repeat infinitely in identical cycles, every joy and every suffering returning exactly as before? Yet Nietzsche's genius lies not in proposing this as literal truth, but in recognizing its power as the ultimate criterion for distinguishing between fundamentally different types of human beings. If this thought gained possession of you, he suggests, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. Here we encounter eternal recurrence's dual function. It serves simultaneously as a description of reality's possible structure and as a test of individual psychological health and spiritual development. The selective mechanism operates with ruthless precision. Eternal recurrence eliminates those who cannot bear the weight of existence without external justification, whilst affirming those capable of unconditional life-love. This creates a natural selection of spiritual types based entirely on their relationship to existence itself. The criterion cuts through all pretense and self-deception. The question in each and everything, do you desire this? Once more, and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Those who pass this test demonstrate their capacity for amor fati and genuine life affirmation, revealing psychological resources sufficient for authentic self-creation. Those who fail expose their secret dependence on otherworldly hopes, their fundamental resentment against the conditions of earthly existence, their need for external validation or metaphysical comfort. The connection to amor fati emerges as the crucial bridge between the thought experiment and its transformative power. Loving fate requires accepting that everything, including what we desperately wish to change, belongs to the whole that we must affirm. Eternal recurrence demands not merely acceptance, but active willing of everything that has happened and will happen. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati. Nietzsche declares that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. This represents a fundamental transformation in consciousness, moving from conditional acceptance, loving life despite its difficulties, to unconditional affirmation, loving life because of its total character, including its difficulties. The test reveals whether one possesses the spiritual health necessary for such complete affirmation. Eternal recurrence thus creates the bridge between higher men, who ultimately fail this test, and the Übermensch, who passes it completely. The thought separates those who remain trapped in resentment and otherworldly hope from those who achieve genuine this worldly affirmation. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more"? The demon's question strips away all illusions, all hopes for redemption or escape, all possibilities of improvement or progress. Only those who can meet this ultimate challenge possess the psychological resources necessary for creating new values and cultural possibilities. Eternal recurrence serves as both the final test of individual transformation and the foundation for cultural renewal through exceptional individuals who have achieved unconditional life affirmation, becoming capable of the revaluation of all values that our age desperately requires. Part 11. The Philosophy of Power and Creativity. Nietzsche's most radical epistemological insight strikes at the very foundation of Western philosophy, the assumption that genuine knowledge requires the elimination of subjective bias and personal interest. Against centuries of philosophical tradition, seeking objective truth through the removal of perspective, Nietzsche argues that all knowledge serves particular interests and expresses specific perspectives shaped by the knower's position, needs, and will to power. This isn't a flaw to be corrected, but the fundamental nature of knowledge itself. There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing, Nietzsche declares. And the more effects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing. The more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be. This formulation revolutionizes our understanding of objectivity itself. Rather than the elimination of perspective, objectivity becomes the synthesis of multiple perspectives, a richer, more comprehensive view that acknowledges its own constructed nature whilst embracing the creative power of interpretation. This transforms the entire project of knowledge from discovering eternal truths to creating useful interpretations. The traditional philosophical quest for absolute knowledge. Knowledge from no particular point of view becomes not merely impossible, but undesirable. Such knowledge would be lifeless, disconnected from human needs, interests, and creative potential. Nietzsche recognizes that what makes knowledge valuable is precisely its connection to life, its capacity to enhance power and creative capability. His famous formulation that there are no facts, only interpretations, doesn't collapse into simple relativism, but opens a more sophisticated understanding of how knowledge functions in human existence. All interpretations serve life and the enhancement of power rather than abstract truth. The falseness of a judgment is not for us necessarily an objection to a judgment. Nietzsche observes. The question is, how far an opinion is life-furthering, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps species-cultivating? This shifts evaluation from correspondence to reality toward effects on human flourishing and creative potential. The relationship between knowledge and power reveals itself as fundamental rather than accidental. What we call truth often serves to enhance our feeling of power, control, and creative capability rather than providing neutral information about reality. The will to truth is actually a form of will to power the desire to master reality through intellectual domination. What then is truth? Nietzsche asks. A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. This analysis liberates human thinking from the burden of discovering eternal truths and reveals its creative function. If knowledge serves power rather than neutral description, then humans are free to create new forms of knowledge that serve life enhancement rather than life denial. The recognition transforms philosophy from a descriptive enterprise seeking to mirror reality into a creative practice of concept and value formation. Yet this raises the crucial question: how do we evaluate different perspectives if there are no neutral criteria for determining truth? Nietzsche's answer points toward aesthetic and life-enhancing criteria rather than logical or empirical ones. We have art, lest we perish of the truth, he suggests, indicating that beauty and creative power provide better evaluative standards than correspondence to reality. Perspectivism doesn't eliminate evaluation, but changes the criteria from truth to beauty, from correspondence to creativity, from objectivity to life enhancement. This reveals thinking's creative rather than merely descriptive function, pointing toward a new understanding of philosophy as artistic creation of concepts and values rather than discovery of eternal truths. The philosopher becomes an artist of ideas, creating interpretations that enhance life's creative potential, rather than discovering fixed realities that constrain it. Nietzsche's philosophical journey reaches its culmination in a return to his earliest and most radical insight. Existence justifies itself aesthetically rather than morally or rationally. In The Birth of Tragedy, he declared that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified. This wasn't merely a youthful pronouncement, but the foundation stone of his entire mature philosophy. Where traditional philosophy sought to justify life through moral purpose or rational order, Nietzsche recognized that life creates meaning through beauty and creative power rather than conformity to external standards. This aesthetic foundation transforms completely how we understand human existence and its possibilities. Life becomes not a moral test to be passed or a rational problem to be solved, but an artistic creation to be shaped according to criteria of beauty, style, and creative power. The highest individuals treat their existence as a work of art, crafting themselves with the same deliberate attention that sculptors bring to marble or composers to musical themes. One thing is needful, Nietzsche writes, to give style to one's character a great and rare art. It is practiced by those who survey all the strengths and weaknesses of their nature and then fit them into an artistic plan until every one of them appears as art and reason. This isn't mere self-improvement, but fundamental self-creation. The authentic individual integrates all aspects of their nature, including what conventional morality would condemn as weaknesses or flaws, into a unified style that expresses their particular form of creative power. Such self-creation requires abandoning the comfortable illusion that we can discover pre-existing meanings or values waiting to be found. Instead, we must become artists of our own existence, legislators of our own values, creators of our own significance. This transforms philosophy itself, from the discovery of eternal truths to the creation of new possibilities for human existence. The philosopher, as Nietzsche understands the role, becomes the man of the most comprehensive responsibility who has the conscience for the overall development of mankind. Philosophers don't merely analyze existing reality, but create the conceptual frameworks and value systems that make different forms of human existence possible. They serve as artists of culture, shaping the horizons within which future generations will live and create. This aesthetic criterion provides a naturalistic foundation for making evaluations that doesn't depend on metaphysical or religious assumptions. What is good? Nietzsche asks. All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. But this power manifests aesthetically good perspectives, and values enable the creation of beautiful and powerful forms of human existence, whilst bad ones diminish creative potential and produce ugly or weak forms of life. The aesthetic criterion thus becomes the foundation for Nietzsche's entire project of revaluation. Rather than asking whether beliefs are true or actions moral, we ask whether they enhance life's creative power and generate forms of existence worthy of eternal affirmation. This shifts evaluation from abstract principles to concrete manifestations of human creative potential, from universal rules to particular expressions of individual style and cultural greatness. Through this aesthetic lens, Nietzsche's philosophy reveals itself as fundamentally creative rather than merely critical, not just diagnosing the sickness of his age, but providing the conceptual tools for cultural renewal through the creation of new possibilities for human greatness. Great health represents Nietzsche's vision of the ideal condition for cultural creativity, a state where individuals become capable of incorporating opposing forces, perspectives, and experiences without being destroyed by them. This isn't merely physical vitality, but a profound synthesis of intellectual honesty and creative power that enables genuine cultural achievement. As Nietzsche describes it, the great health that one does not merely have but also constantly acquires and must acquire, because one gives it up again and again, and must give it up. This dynamic character reveals something crucial about Nietzsche's understanding of human excellence. Great health isn't a static condition, but a continuous process of overcoming obstacles and integrating contradictions. The individual with great health can absorb the most disturbing insights about existence: the absence of inherent meaning, the arbitrary nature of moral systems, the groundlessness of truth claims, while simultaneously maintaining the creative power to generate new values and possibilities. They become strong enough to look directly into the abyss without losing their capacity for joy and artistic creation. This ideal provides the psychological foundation for the kind of individuals who could create authentic culture in the modern world. Traditional culture relied on shared metaphysical beliefs and moral certainties that provided stability but limited creative potential. Great health offers a different foundation, not the security of fixed beliefs, but the strength to create meaning in the face of uncertainty, to find joy in the very process of questioning and overcoming. The philosopher-physician emerges as the embodiment of this great health, capable of diagnosing cultural sickness whilst pointing towards spiritual renewal. This represents Nietzsche's understanding of his own philosophical mission, not merely criticizing existing values, but creating the conditions for cultural transformation. The philosopher-physician must understand both the symptoms of cultural decadence and the conditions that would enable genuine human flourishing. As Nietzsche declares, "I am not a man, I am dynamite." This therapeutic dimension requires extraordinary psychological strength. The philosopher-physician must be able to see clearly without being paralyzed by what they see, to diagnose honestly without losing hope for renewal. They must combine the free spirit's intellectual courage with the artist's creative vision, becoming simultaneously destroyer and creator, critic and visionary. The ultimate achievement of great health manifests as joyful wisdom, the ability to see clearly without losing the capacity for joy, to think the most difficult thoughts whilst maintaining creative power and life affirmation. This represents the synthesis of all Nietzsche's philosophical insights: the free spirit's intellectual honesty, the artist's creative power, and the Übermensch's unconditional life affirmation. As he puts it, "Perhaps I know best why man alone laughs. He alone suffers so deeply that he had to invent laughter." Joyful wisdom transforms suffering into creative material, doubt into artistic inspiration, and intellectual honesty into aesthetic affirmation. The individual who achieves this state can affirm existence unconditionally whilst maintaining the capacity for creative transformation. They become capable of saying yes to life, not despite its suffering and meaninglessness, but because of the creative opportunities these very conditions provide. This points toward Nietzsche's ultimate vision: new possibilities for human greatness, once the constraints of traditional morality and metaphysics are overcome through aesthetic self-creation and the cultivation of great health. If enough individuals achieve this synthesis of intellectual honesty and creative power, they could create the conditions for a new form of culture that affirms life without requiring metaphysical consolation or moral justification. As Nietzsche anticipates, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." The promise lies not in returning to some golden age of shared beliefs, but in moving forward to a culture created by individuals strong enough to create meaning without external validation, to find joy without cosmic reassurance, to affirm life without metaphysical guarantees. Great health becomes both the culmination of Nietzsche's philosophical project and the foundation for future human development, beyond the limitations of traditional European culture. Part 12. The Dionysian Philosopher. Nietzsche's final philosophical vision crystallizes around a single, defining opposition: Dionysus versus the crucified. This is not merely another contrast in his thinking, but the ultimate symbol through which he frames the fundamental choice facing human consciousness after the death of God. Have I been understood? He asks in his final work, Dionysus versus the crucified. Here stands the deepest question of existence itself. Will we affirm life in its totality, including its suffering, chaos, and destruction? Or will we deny this world in favor of another that promises escape from life's tragic character? The crucified represents everything Nietzsche has diagnosed as life-denying in human culture. This symbol embodies the otherworldly hope that treats earthly existence as a vale of tears, something to be endured rather than celebrated, transcended rather than embraced. The crucifixion becomes the ultimate expression of resentment against existence, transforming suffering into a cosmic injustice that demands otherworldly compensation. Christianity, in Nietzsche's analysis, makes suffering meaningful only by promising its eventual elimination, teaching humanity to hate the very conditions that make life possible. Dionysus, by contrast, represents the God who says yes to existence precisely because it includes suffering, destruction, and chaos. This is not the naive optimism that denies life's darkness, but the profound affirmation that finds meaning in the totality of existence, including its most terrible aspects. Dionysus is the symbol of life's creative destructive power, the force that generates meaning through aesthetic creation, rather than moral justification or rational explanation. Where the crucified seeks redemption from existence, Dionysus finds existence itself redemptive. The Dionysian perspective treats existence as eternal creative play, a cosmic artwork that creates and destroys forms without requiring external purpose or divine authorization. The world as a work of art that gives birth to itself. This becomes Nietzsche's alternative to both Christian otherworldliness and modern scientific materialism. The Dionysian vision finds meaning not in conformity to moral rules or rational principles, but in the beauty and power of existence's creative processes themselves. This represents a complete revaluation. Instead of judging life by external standards, we learn to find in life itself the source of all value and meaning. The Dionysian philosopher emerges as Nietzsche's ideal of what human consciousness might become after overcoming traditional metaphysical and moral constraints. This figure can think the most difficult thoughts, can face the absence of cosmic purpose, the reality of suffering, the groundlessness of moral systems, whilst maintaining joy and creativity. This is the synthesis of intellectual honesty and aesthetic affirmation that Nietzsche sees as humanity's highest possibility. A spirit thus emancipated stands in the midst of the universe with a joyful and trusting fatalism, Nietzsche writes. In the faith that only what is separate and individual may be rejected, that in the totality, everything is redeemed and affirmed. The Dionysian philosopher has overcome resentment, guilt, and otherworldly hope, achieving the psychological capacity to affirm existence unconditionally whilst maintaining creative power. This is not resignation but the highest form of spiritual achievement, the ability to say yes to life, knowing exactly what that yes entails. This vision represents Nietzsche's return to Greek wisdom, but at a higher level. The Greeks, particularly in their tragic art, had achieved a form of life affirmation that could incorporate suffering without being crushed by it. But Nietzsche's post-metaphysical affirmation goes beyond ancient Greek culture. By incorporating modern psychological and historical insights whilst recovering their capacity for tragic joy, we have art, lest we perish of the truth. This recognition that aesthetic creation is necessary for life becomes the foundation for a new form of existence. The Dionysian philosopher combines Greek aesthetic wisdom with modern intellectual honesty, creating a form of life affirmation appropriate to post-Christian existence. This is not a simple return to the past, but a spiral return that recovers ancient wisdom through modern consciousness. The most radical transformation in Nietzsche's philosophy emerges through his doctrine of the innocence of becoming, the recognition that existence itself stands beyond good and evil, expressing nothing more than creative power, manifesting itself in eternal flux. This represents the ultimate overcoming of the moral interpretation of existence that has dominated Western thought since Plato first divided reality into the perfect realm of forms and our fallen material world. Where traditional philosophy has sought to judge existence according to moral categories, finding it wanting and in need of redemption, Nietzsche eliminates moral categories entirely from our understanding of what is. The innocence of becoming. No one is responsible for man's being there at all, for his being such and such, or for his being in these circumstances or in this environment. This insight strikes at the foundation of guilt, resentment, and otherworldly hope that have shaped human psychology for millennia. If no one bears responsibility for the conditions of existence, neither gods nor cosmic forces nor metaphysical principles, then the entire structure of moral debt collapses. Existence owes us nothing, because existence is not a moral agent capable of owing anything. It simply is, creating and destroying forms in an endless dance of becoming that aims at nothing beyond its own expression. This elimination of moral categories from existence itself provides unprecedented liberation for human value creation. Once we recognize that life is neither good nor evil but simply creative power expressing itself, humans become free to create values based on aesthetic and life-enhancing criteria rather than conformity to supposed cosmic moral laws. The universe does not dictate our values through moral commands embedded in its structure. Instead, it provides the raw material of becoming from which we can craft new possibilities for human flourishing. The doctrine of innocence penetrates deeper than mere philosophical theory. It transforms the psychological foundations of human existence. Traditional morality depends upon the assumption that existence contains inherent guilt requiring redemption, cosmic justice demanding satisfaction, or metaphysical debt necessitating payment through suffering or self-denial. Nietzsche's insight that becoming aims at nothing and achieves nothing dissolves these assumptions entirely. If becoming has no goal beyond its own expression, then existence cannot fail to meet some cosmic standard because no such standard exists. This psychological transformation enables humans to relate to existence through gratitude and creative participation, rather than resentment and demand for compensation. Without guilt or cosmic debt, the energy previously devoted to moral self-flagellation becomes available for creative self-realization. The innocence of becoming is not naivety, but the result of philosophical sophistication that has seen through moral illusions to the creative reality beneath them. The liberation this brings manifests through the recognition that humans can create values and meaning without requiring cosmic authorization or metaphysical foundation. Traditional philosophy has always sought external validation for human values, either through divine command, rational necessity, or natural law. Nietzsche's doctrine eliminates this need entirely by showing that existence itself provides no such validation because it operates beyond the sphere of validation altogether. This makes authentic self-creation possible for the first time in human history. We, however, want to become those we are human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. If existence has no inherent moral character, then human creativity is not constrained by cosmic moral laws, but is free to create new possibilities based on aesthetic and life-enhancing criteria. This represents the ultimate foundation for human freedom and responsibility, not freedom from external constraints, but freedom for creative self-determination within the conditions of existence. The connection to eternal recurrence emerges through the recognition that only innocent becoming can be affirmed unconditionally without remainder or reservation. The elimination of moral categories makes possible the complete affirmation that eternal recurrence demands. In his final work before madness claimed him, Nietzsche presents himself not as a systematic philosopher constructing theoretical edifices, but as something far more dangerous and necessary, a cultural physician who has diagnosed the spiritual sickness of modernity and a prophet who points toward radical transformation. Ecce Homo offers his retrospective self-portrait. And what emerges is extraordinary, a thinker who claims to embody the very transformation he advocates, rather than merely describing it from a theoretical distance. I am not a man, I am dynamite, he declares, positioning himself as the explosive force that will shatter the comfortable illusions sustaining European culture. This self-presentation carries profound implications. Nietzsche presents his life and work as living proof that the philosophical transformation he advocates is actually possible. He has become the evidence for his own philosophy, demonstrating through his existence that one can affirm life fully whilst abandoning all metaphysical supports and traditional moral certainties. His philosophical journey itself becomes the argument, not just the content of his ideas, but the fact that he could develop them, live them, and maintain intellectual and spiritual vitality throughout represents his ultimate philosophical achievement. The prophetic dimension proves equally crucial. Nietzsche presents himself as one who has seen the future of European culture with terrifying clarity. He understands that the death of God will precipitate a crisis of meaning that most cannot yet imagine, and he positions his work as preparation for this inevitable confrontation with nihilism. His philosophy becomes not merely analysis but cultural medicine, bitter but necessary treatment for a civilization that must learn to create meaning rather than discover it. Looking back across his intellectual development, Nietzsche reveals how each stage contributed essential elements to his final vision of existence affirmation. His early aesthetic philosophy established that life requires justification through creative achievement rather than moral conformity. His genealogical investigations exposed how moral systems function as expressions of psychological types and cultural conditions. His cultural criticism diagnosed the spiritual emptiness beneath modern optimism and progress. Each phase proved necessary for reaching the complete revaluation of all values. The concept of decadence. I have grasped decadence itself as a necessary phenomenon, not as something one could ward off, but as something one must go through, he reflects. This insight transforms his entire philosophical journey into systematic preparation for cultural transformation. Even his suffering, his isolation, his intellectual struggles become meaningful as the necessary conditions for developing the psychological strength and philosophical clarity required to affirm existence without metaphysical consolation. The retrospective view reveals the coherent architecture underlying what might have appeared as philosophical wandering. His investigation of tragedy, his critique of morality, his analysis of nihilism, his vision of eternal recurrence, all prove to be stages in a single project of preparing humanity for life beyond traditional certainties. The philosopher emerges not as detached theorist, but as existential pioneer, mapping territory that others will eventually need to inhabit. Most remarkably, Nietzsche claims to have accomplished the revaluation of all values not through theoretical argument alone, but through existential achievement. He presents himself as living proof that authentic existence remains possible after the collapse of traditional foundations. I have often asked myself whether I am not more heavily obligated to the hardest years of my life than to any others. As my inmost nature teaches me, whatever is necessary, as seen from the heights and in the sense of a great economy, is also the useful par excellence. One should not only bear it, one should love it. Amor fati, that is my inmost nature. This represents his ultimate philosophical accomplishment, demonstrating that one can embrace existence completely, including its suffering and uncertainty, without requiring external justification or metaphysical support. By embodying amor fati and joyful wisdom in his own life, he proves that post-metaphysical existence, affirmation, is psychologically possible. Part 13. Conclusion. Nietzsche's philosophical journey reveals itself as a single, unified project, the systematic preparation for authentic human greatness in a world stripped of metaphysical foundations. From his early recognition that art alone could justify existence through his devastating critique of Christian morality, to his vision of self-creating individuals who affirm life unconditionally, every stage serves one overarching goal: making genuine human flourishing possible without otherworldly support. His entire intellectual development represents a coherent response to the crisis of meaning created by the collapse of traditional, religious, and metaphysical certainties. As he understood his task, my task, the dehumanization of nature, and then the naturalization of humanity after it has acquired the pure concept of nature, his critique of Christianity, his genealogy of morals, his analysis of nihilism, and his vision of the Übermensch all serve the single purpose of creating conditions for authentic human excellence without cosmic authorization. His ultimate answer to nihilism transforms the entire question of meaning. From a theoretical problem to a practical challenge of creative self-development, meaning comes not from discovering inherent purpose, but from creating values through the unconditional affirmation of existence by exceptional individuals capable of bearing the responsibility of value creation. This represents a complete transformation of humanity's relationship to meaning and value. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Not because suffering reveals hidden purpose, but because it provides the resistance necessary for creative self-overcoming. Nietzsche's solution to existential meaninglessness is not the discovery of concealed significance, but the creation of meaning through aesthetic self-creation and cultural achievement. The question shifts from, why does life matter? To, how can I make life matter through my own creative power? His diagnosis retains startling contemporary relevance as modern culture continues struggling with the consequences of the death of God. and the challenge of creating meaning in a disenchanted world. The problems he identified: nihilism, cultural decadence, the rise of mass society, the difficulty of individual authenticity, remain central challenges for contemporary existence. His prophecy proves prophetic. What I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently: the advent of nihilism. His analysis of resentment illuminates modern political movements. His critique of herd mentality applies to mass media and consumer culture, and his vision of self-creation remains essential for anyone seeking authentic existence without absolute foundations. What Nietzsche's philosophy ultimately reveals about human existence is that we are the animals who create values, and our highest possibility lies in taking conscious responsibility for this creative power whilst affirming the tragic beauty of existence itself. This represents both a diagnosis of the human condition and a prescription for human flourishing. Become who you are, not by discovering some predetermined essence, but by creating your own nature through conscious self-development. Humans are fundamentally self-creating beings whose essence lies not in conformity to external standards, but in the deliberate creation of their own values and character. This makes his philosophy simultaneously descriptive and prescriptive, a vision of what humans are and what they might become through conscious cultivation of their creative power, whilst affirming existence unconditionally, finding in life itself sufficient justification for the struggle of becoming.